Hey there, and welcome back. If you are lying back now in the warm and the quiet, with the day finally behind you, and nothing left that you have to do, then you have come to just the right place. Tonight is a night for going a long way off, across more than 700 years, and away to the cold green hills of Scotland, to an age of spears and castles and long dark winters, and into the life of one man who is remembered there still as the greatest of all that country's kings. This is for anyone who is weary tonight, anyone who has been carrying something heavy and would like for a few hours to set it down and be somewhere else entirely. You do not need to follow every name or hold on to every date. You need only let the words drift past you like slow water and let yourself be carried along by them. For the man whose story this is would become, before his life was done, a hunted outlaw with a price upon his head, and his brothers dead, and his wife shut in an English cage, a monarch crowned with a thin band of gold because his enemies had carried the true crown away, and a soldier who would wager a whole kingdom upon 2 days of battle beside a small Scottish stream. And at the very end, when his body was laid in the cold ground, his heart would be cut from it and carried off to war in a distant land, all because of a promise made to a dying lord. But every part of that still lies ahead of us, and the night is long, and we have time enough to walk the whole of it together, gently, from the very beginning. Before we set out, let me say one quiet thing, and then I will not break the spell again. If these slow journeys into far-off times are something you would like to find your way back to on another night when sleep is slow in coming, then you are always welcome to follow along, so that there is another one here waiting for you whenever you need it. And if you feel like it, you might leave a word to say where in the age you are listening from tonight and what the hour is where you are, whether it is early evening for you or the very middle of the night. I do love looking through those notes and seeing all the quiet corners of the earth where someone is lying awake in the night, and feeling that for a little while we are keeping one another company across all that distance. There is no hurry about any of it, and nothing you need do. It costs nothing, and it only helps these old stories go on being told in the gloom. Picture this: a green headland on the southwestern coast of Scotland, where the land runs out into a cold grey sea, and set upon that headland a castle of dark stone. Its walls damp with the salt spray that the wind throws up from the rocks far below. Gulls turn and cry above the towers. Beyond the water, on a clear day, the blue shapes of distant islands lie low on the horizon, and the great rock of Ailsa rises alone out of the firth like the back of some sleeping creature. This is Turnberry, the chief stronghold of the Earls of Carrick, a place of wind and sea light at the edge of the known world. And here, by the best account we have, on a summer day in 1274, in a chamber within those salt-washed walls, a child was born, who was given the old family name of Robert, and who would one day be called, by his own people and by the centuries after him, the Bruce. He was the eldest son, and one of 10 children, of a marriage that joined 2 proud and ancient lines. His father was Robert de Bruce, the 6th lord of a place called Annandale, a broad valley away to the south and east, near the border with England. The Bruces were a family of Norman blood, descended from a knight who had come north into Scotland a century and a half before, in the days of good King David, and had been granted that valley of Annandale to hold and to rule. They were lords of the older, harder kind, men of the saddle and the sword, and there ran in them, alongside their Scottish lands, a thread of royal blood, for they were descended far back from one of Scotland's early kings. That descent was a small and quiet thing while the throne was safely filled. It would become, in time, the most dangerous inheritance in the kingdom. His mother brought a different blood again. She was Marjorie, Countess of Carrick, in her own right, the holder of that wild and Gaelic earldom on the western coast, and she was, by every account that survives, a woman of fierce and formidable spirit. There was a tale told of her, which may be more legend than truth, but which catches her character all the same. That when a young knight came riding through her lands, bearing news of the death of her first husband, she was so taken with him that she had him brought to her castle and kept there, half guest and half prisoner, until he agreed to marry her. Whether that is true or only a tale, the man she married in that fashion was Robert de Bruce, and from the two of them, the Norman lord of Annandale and the Gaelic countess of Carrick, came the boy at Turnberry. So from his very first breath, he was a child of two worlds, and that doubleness ran through the whole of his days. From his mother's side, he was of the Gaelic West, of the old Celtic Scotland of the clans, and the islands, and the soft-running speech of the Highlands. From his father's side, he was of the Norman, French-speaking nobility, the world of stone castles and feudal lordship, and the chivalry that bound together the ruling families of all of Western Christendom. He would grow up speaking the Gaelic of his mother's country, the early Scots tongue of the lowland folk, and the Anglo-Norman French of his own rank, and he would have a working hold on the Latin of the Church and the law besides. He was, in short, equipped to move through every part of the strange divided land into which he had been born, and he would need every part of that fluency before he was finished. He was raised, as the sons of the great were raised, not in one place, but across a whole circuit of family strongholds, moving with the household from Turnberry on its headland to Lochmaben in the south, and to the other castles of his father's and mother's lands, learning as he went the skills proper to his station. He was taught to ride and to handle a sword and a spear, to hunt and to hawk, to carry himself with the grave courtesy that the nobility prized. And he was given, too, a feeling for the older arts of the mind, for it is recorded that as a grown man he could recite from memory passages of the romances of chivalry, the tales of Charlemagne and his knights, and would read them aloud to his followers around the fire on the hard nights of his wars. The boy who would be a hunted fugitive in the heather had been first a mighty lord's son, schooled in the songs of heroes. To understand the age he was born into, you have to understand that Scotland in those years was not the settled, single nation we might imagine. It was a young and fragile kingdom, only a few centuries old, and within it lay two very different countries uneasily joined. There were the lowlands, the gentler country of the south and east, with their towns and their farms and their stone abbeys, where the speech was the early Scots, and the lords, for the most part, lived in the Norman fashion, looking south toward England and the wider world. And there were the Highlands and the Western Isles, a vast and mountainous wilderness of glen and loch and sea passage, where the Gaelic tongue held sway and the old clans ruled their own remote countries, and where the writ of any distant king ran thin or not at all. The Bruces, with their lands in both the lowland south and the Gaelic west, stood with a foot in each of these worlds. Over the whole of it, in the year of Robert's birth, there reigned a strong and able king, Alexander III, under whom Scotland had known a stretch of peace and growing prosperity, so that the kingdom seemed safe and whole. And a child born to one of its vast families might have looked forward to a life of ordinary lordship, of managing his estates and serving his king, and adding, perhaps, a little to the standing of his house. No one looking at the infant in the chamber at Turnberry could have guessed that within 20 years that settled world would be shattered, and that this child, above all others, would be caught up in the breaking of it. For the peace of Scotland rested, as the peace of every medieval kingdom rested, upon the life of one man, and upon the orderly passing of his crown to his heirs. And it is here, in the failing of that simple thing, that the whole long tragedy begins. Alexander had children, and the realm seemed secure in its succession, and for the first years of Robert's boyhood there was no shadow on the land. But death, in that age, came swiftly and without warning to the great and the small alike, and over a few short years it would empty the royal house of Scotland almost entirely, and leave the throne hanging over an abyss. That emptying and the terrible contest it set loose is where we must go next, for it is the ground out of which everything else in Robert's life would grow. He was a boy in his father's castles, learning his letters and his weapons, while far away the slow machinery of disaster was beginning quietly to turn. Let us follow it and see how a peaceful kingdom came apart and how a child of the House of Bruce was drawn, step by step, toward a crown that would cost him almost everything he had. Now we come to the great unravelling, and it began, as such things so often did, with a fall from a horse on a wild night. In the spring of 1286, when Robert was a boy of 11 or 12, Alexander III rode out from Edinburgh in darkness and foul weather, hurrying along the coast toward his young queen at Kinghorn. Somewhere on that black and storm-lashed road, his horse missed its footing, and the monarch was thrown, and in the morning he was found dead at the foot of a bank, his neck broken. He was not an old man, and his death was a calamity beyond reckoning, for the cruel truth was that he had outlived all of his children. His sons were dead, his daughter was dead, and the only person left of his direct blood was a tiny granddaughter far away over the sea in Norway, a little girl of 3 named Margaret, the daughter of the Norwegian king, whom the Scots came to call the Maid of Norway. So the crown of Scotland passed to an infant who had never set foot in the nation, and the kingdom was governed in her name by a council of grand men called the Guardians, who held the realm together as best they could and waited for the child to grow. A plan was made, a hopeful and sensible plan, to marry the little maid to the young son of the English king, and so to join the 2 crowns in peace through the marriage of 2 children. And then, in the autumn of 1290, the small queen was at last put aboard ship to be brought to her kingdom, and somewhere on that cold northern crossing she sickened. And by the time the vessel reached the Orkney Islands, she was dead, a child of 7 who had never seen the land she was born to rule. With her died the last of the old royal line, and the throne of Scotland stood suddenly and completely empty. What followed is known to Scottish history as the Great Cause, and it was the hinge upon which everything turned. With no clear heir, the crown was claimed by a whole crowd of nobles who could trace some thread of royal descent, and of these claimants 2 stood far above the rest. One was John Balliol, a leading lord with lands in both Scotland and England, who descended from the eldest daughter of an early royal brother. The other was Robert de Bruce, the 5th Lord of Annandale, an old and proud and tough-minded man. The grandfather of our Robert, who descended from a younger daughter of that same line, but who argued that he stood 1 generation nearer to the royal stock. This old lord, whom history calls the competitor, had spent his whole long life believing that the crown was rightfully his, and he passed that fierce conviction down through his son to his grandson. So that the boy growing up at Turnberry was raised on the understanding that his family had been cheated of a throne. To settle the dispute and to keep the kingdom from sliding into civil war, the Scots made a fateful choice. They invited the English crown, Edward I, to act as judge between the rival claimants. It seemed reasonable. Edward was the most powerful and respected monarch in those islands, a near neighbour, a man of law. But it was like inviting a wolf to settle a quarrel among sheep. For Edward had ambitions of his own, and he saw in Scotland's leaderless misery the chance of a lifetime. Edward agreed to judge the cause, but he set a price upon his judgment. Before he would rule on the matter, he demanded that all the claimants and the whole community of the realm acknowledge him as the overlord of Scotland, the feudal superior to whom the Scottish king would owe homage and obedience. It was a demand that struck at the very root of Scottish independence, but the claimants were so hungry for the crown and so afraid of one another that one by one they swallowed it and did him homage, the Bruces among them. Then, having established his lordship, Edward weighed the claims, and in 1292 gave his judgment. He awarded the crown to John Balliol, whose claim by the strict letter of descent was the stronger. The old competitor of Bruce, cheated as he saw it of the prize of his days, refused to bend the knee to the new monarch, and rather than do homage to Balliol, he resigned his claim and his lands to his son, who in turn passed the earldom of Carrick to young Robert. So before he was 20, the future king already carried in his blood and in his family's bitter memory the conviction that the wrong man sat upon the throne of Scotland and that the crown belonged by right to the house of Bruce. That conviction was the seed of everything, but the more immediate disaster was not the Bruce's wounded pride. It was that Edward of England, having made one Scottish monarch do homage to him, now believed that he owned the land. The man who now turned his cold and brilliant attention upon Scotland was one of the most formidable kings ever to sit upon the English throne. Edward I was tall and long of limb, so that men called him Longshanks. A soldier and a lawgiver of iron will and tireless energy, who had already conquered Wales and bent it to his rule, and who was not a man to hold a thing loosely once his hand had closed upon it. He treated John Balliol not as a brother monarch, but as a servant, summoning him to English courts, overruling his judgments, demanding Scottish soldiers and Scottish money for English wars, until the wretched Balliol was so humiliated that his own nobles took the government out of his feeble hands. Pushed too far at last, the Scots did a bold and desperate thing. They made a treaty of alliance with France, England's great enemy, the beginning of that long friendship between Scotland and France that men would come to call the Old Alliance. To Edward this was rank rebellion, and in 1296 he came north with a mighty army to crush it. He stormed the rich trading town of Berwick and put its people to a slaughter so terrible that it was remembered with horror for generations. He smashed a Scottish army at Dunbar, and he stripped poor King John of his crown and his dignity in a ceremony of calculated cruelty, tearing the royal arms from his coat, so that men ever after called him Tomb Tabard, the empty surcoat. Then Edward set about erasing the very idea of Scotland as a kingdom. He carried off to England the sacred stone of Scone, the ancient block of rock upon which the kings of Scots had been made for centuries, and set it in Westminster beneath his own throne. He seized the records and the regalia of the realm, and he placed the nation under English officials and English garrisons, a conquered province with no king of its own. Scotland, it seemed, had simply ceased to exist. But a nation is not so easily unmade, and a land that is conquered does not always stay quiet. Within a year of Edward's triumph, Scotland rose against him, and it rose not under its vast lords, who had mostly submitted, but under men of lesser rank, who would not bow. The greatest of these was a knight of no great estate named William Wallace, a giant of a man, fierce and uncompromising, who gathered the common folk and the lesser gentry to him, and fell upon the English garrisons. In the autumn of 1297, together with a northern leader named Andrew Moray, Wallace won a stunning victory at Stirling Bridge, where the Scots caught the English army as it crossed a narrow bridge over the River Forth and destroyed it utterly. For a time Wallace ruled Scotland as its guardian in the name of the absent Balliol, and the nation was free. But Edward came north again in person, and in the summer of 1298 he brought Wallace to battle at Falkirk, where the long English bows shot the close-packed rings of Scottish spearmen to pieces, and the rising was broken. Wallace gave up the guardianship and became a hunted man, and some years later he was betrayed into English hands and carried to London and put to death with great and deliberate cruelty, his courage unbroken to the end. He had lit a fire that could not now be put out, but he had not lived to see it bring forth a sovereign end. Where, in all of this, was the young lord of Carrick? The honest answer, is that in these years he moved back and forth between the two sides in a way that can look, at first, like simple faithlessness, and that his enemies have always painted as such. At times he came out for the Scottish cause and fought against the English. At times he made his peace with Edward and submitted, and once, in the troubled years after Falkirk, he was made one of the guardians of Scotland, sharing that office with the man who was his deadliest rival, a powerful lord named John Comyn, who was nephew to the deposed King Balliol, and who carried the rival claim to the throne. The two men could not work together. Their hatred was old and deep, rooted in the rivalry of their houses, and in the question of who, if Balliol never returned, should be king. Bruce resigned the guardianship rather than serve beside Comyn, and went his own careful, watchful way. We should not judge him too harshly for his shifting course. He was a young man playing a deadly game with the highest stakes there are, surrounded by enemies on every side, watching three powers contend for his nation: the English king, the exiled Balliol and his Comyn kin, and his own family's claim, and trying to keep the Bruce cause alive until the moment came when it could be played for the crown itself. In 1304, his father died, and Robert became at last the head of his house, Lord of Annandale and Earl of Carrick, and the bearer of the long-cherished Bruce, claim to the throne of Scotland. The waiting was almost over. What he did next would change everything, and there would be no going back from it. But let us slow down a little here, for before he reached for the crown, the Scottish lord had a private life as well as a public one, and the two were woven together as they always are. While he was still a young man, before the worst of the troubles had broken, he had married for the first time. His bride was a young noblewoman named Isabella, a daughter of the Earl of Mar, one of the old Gaelic earls of the north, and the match was the ordinary sort of marriage that bound the grand families of Scotland to one another. We know very little of her, only her name and her family and the brief span of her life, but she gave him a daughter, a little girl named Marjorie, after his own mother. And then, while she was still scarcely more than a girl herself, Isabella died, in or soon after the birth of that child. Death in childbed was the great silent danger that hung over every woman of that age, the highest and the lowest alike, and it took Isabella, as it took so many thousands of others, and left Robert a widower while he was still young, with a motherless infant daughter to be raised by the women of his household. We cannot know what he felt, for the records of that hard world do not trouble much with the hearts of men, but the loss was real, and the small girl Marjorie would grow up to play her own part in his story, and to carry his blood, in the end, to a place neither of them could have dreamed. For now she was only a baby in a great cold castle, and her father was a young lord with a dead wife and a dangerous inheritance, watching and waiting in a kingdom coming apart. In the years that followed, he carried his loss and his ambition alike in silence, walking the careful path we have already seen, and in 1302 he married again. And this second marriage tells us much about the kind of game he was playing. His new bride was Elizabeth de Burgh, and she was no minor Scottish heiress, but the daughter of one of the mightiest lords in all the lands of the English crown, Richard de Burgh, the Earl of Ulster, a great Anglo-Irish magnate who was a close friend and faithful supporter of Edward of England himself. To marry into that family was to plant one foot firmly in Edward's world, to bind himself by the closest ties to the very power that held Scotland down. It was on the face of it the act of a man making his peace with the conqueror, settling into the comfortable life of a leading lord under English overlordship, and perhaps in part that is what it was. But the Bruce was always a man of more than one purpose at a time, and even as he tied himself by marriage to Edward's circle, the old ambition was working in him still. The conviction that he, and not the absent Balliol nor the hated Comyn, was the rightful sovereign of Scots. Elizabeth, for her part, would prove far more than a mere political bargain. She was young, and she was steadfast, and in the terrible years that were coming, she would share her husband's exile and his ruin and a long imprisonment in enemy hands, and never, so far as we can tell, waver in her loyalty to him. The marriage made for advantage became, in the testing, a true and faithful partnership, and she was at his side, in spirit, if not always in body, through the very worst that was to come. And now we arrive at the deed that changed everything, the single violent moment from which there could be no turning back. By the early days of 1306, Robert had at last resolved to make his move for the crown, and he understood that he could not do it while John Comyn, his great rival, stood in his way, for Comyn carried the competing claim and commanded a vast affinity of his own across the north of Scotland. There are different accounts of what passed between the two men, but the heart of the tale is this. Bruce and Comyn met, and there was some manner of bargain or bond between them touching the throne, and Bruce came to believe, rightly or wrongly, that Comyn had betrayed their secret dealings to Edward, which, if true, meant that Bruce's own life was forfeit the moment the English king chose to act. Whether warned by a friend at the English court or simply driven by his own resolve, Bruce rode hard for the southwest of Scotland and sent word to Comyn to meet him. The place they chose for their meeting was a church, the Greyfriars at Dumfries, and they came together there before the high altar, in the holiest part of that holy ground. We will never know exactly what words passed between them, but the old quarrel, the accusation of treachery, the years of hatred, all of it boiled over in that sacred place, and the two men came to blows. And he drew his dagger and struck John Comyn down before the altar of God. He came out of the church, shaken and pale, for he had done a terrible thing, a matter that horrified the whole of Christendom, the shedding of blood in a holy place, murder committed within the sanctuary of the church. The story is told, and it has the ring of that hard age about it, that when his followers saw his face and asked him what was wrong, he said that he feared he had slain the Comyn, and that one of them, a grim knight named Kirkpatrick, answered that this was no matter to leave in doubt, and went into the chapel with another man, and made certain of the deed, so that Comyn did not rise from the altar steps again. True or not, the saying that was put into that knight's mouth that he would make sure passed into the long memory of Scotland. What is certain is that John Comyn died there in the Greyfriars at Dumfries, and that with his death every other course was closed to this man forever. He had killed a mighty lord, the rival claimant to the throne, and he had killed him by sacrilege in a church, before the altar, an act that would bring down upon him the dread sentence of excommunication, the casting out from the faithful and from the hope of heaven itself. He had set the whole power of the Comyn kindred, one of the mightiest in Scotland, against him in undying blood feud, and he had openly defied the crown of England, whose officers would now hunt him as a murderer and a rebel. There was no road back to the safe and comfortable life of a vast lord under English rule. There was now only one road open to him all, and it led either to a throne or to a traitor's death. He, having shed blood before the altar, had nothing left to do but to make himself a crowned ruler, and to do it at once, before his enemies could gather, and let the consequences fall as they would. What followed the killing at Dumfries was one of the boldest and most desperate gambles in all of Scottish history, a race against time to turn a fugitive murderer into a crowned and anointed king before the world could close in upon him. Bruce had perhaps 6 weeks, and he used every hour of them. He rode through the southwest gathering what support he could, seizing castles, sending out word to the men he trusted, and above all he turned to the church. For he knew that without the blessing of the church, a monarch was no true king, and that he stood under the shadow of excommunication for what he had done. Here he found a friend who would risk everything for him. Robert Wishart, the old Bishop of Glasgow, a fierce Scottish patriot who had hated the English conquest for a long time, did not turn his face from the man who had shed blood before an altar. Instead, he gave Bruce absolution for the deed, and more than that, he brought out from hiding the royal robes and the banner of the kings of Scots that he had kept concealed from English hands against just such a day. And he and the Bishop of St. Andrews threw the whole weight of the Scottish Church behind the new sovereign. It was an extraordinary thing for churchmen to do, to absolve and crown a man under the ban of Rome for sacrilege. and it tells us how deep the longing for a sovereign of their own ran in the hearts of the Scots. And so, on a day in late March in 1306, less than 2 months after the dagger fell at Dumfries, the Bruce was made King of Scots upon the ancient moot hill at Scone, near Perth, the immemorial crowning place of his folk. It should have been the proudest day of his days, and in a sense it was, but it was a coronation shadowed by everything that was wrong. The sacred stone of Scone, upon which the kings of Scots had been set for time out of mind, was not there, for Edward had carried it off to Westminster 10 years before, and in its place there could be only a substitute and a hastily made circle of gold for a crown. By the old custom of the realm, the sovereign should have been set upon the throne by the head of the house of Macduff, the Earls of Fife. But the young Earl of Fife was a boy in English keeping, loyal to Edward, and could not or would not come. And here the tale turns to one of the bravest deeds done by anyone in the whole of these wars, and it was done by a woman. The young Earl's aunt, Isabella, Countess of Buchan, claimed her family's ancient right of crowning, and she did a deed of breathtaking courage, for her own husband was a common kinsman to the very man Bruce had killed. And to ride to Scone was to defy her husband, her kindred, and the English monarch all at once. Yet ride she did, and on the day after the first ceremony, she placed the circle of gold upon Robert's head a second time, in the name of the house of Macduff. And so by her hands the old forms were kept, and the new monarch was made whole. She could not have known what it would cost her, and the cost, when it came, would be cruel beyond imagining. For all the solemnity and the courage of that day, he was a crowned ruler of almost nothing. He had a crown of hastily worked gold, a handful of bishops and earls, a few hundred loyal men, and against him stood very nearly the whole world. The mighty common kindred and all their allies were now his blood enemies, sworn to avenge the murder before the altar. The King of England, the most dangerous soldier of the age, was roused to a cold and towering fury and was already turning the full weight of his power northward to destroy him. And the Church of Rome, when the news reached it, would lay upon Robert the dread sentence of excommunication for his sacrilege, cutting him off from the body of the faithful. He had reached out and seized the crown, and now he had to try to hold it, with a tiny band of followers, in a nation where most of the grand men were against him, or sitting fearfully on their hands, against the gathered strength of England. It was very nearly hopeless, and it very nearly ended in the first few months. The crown he had risked his soul to win was about to bring down upon him and upon everyone he loved a season of disaster so complete that a lesser man would have been swept away by it and forgotten. That season is where we must go next, into the worst of it, into the time when the Scottish king lost almost everything a man can lose and still draw breath. The blow fell quickly. Edward, when the news reached him, was beside himself with rage, and he sent north a strong and capable army under one of his finest commanders, Aymer de Valence, who happened also to be a brother-in-law of the murdered Comyn, and so had his own reasons to hate the new sovereign. Edward let it be known that this was to be no ordinary war of chivalry, with its courtesies and its ransoms. The followers of Bruce were to be treated as traitors and rebels, hunted down and shown no mercy. In the high summer of 1306, de Valence lay at Perth with his army, and Bruce came against him there. By the customs of war, the English commander had agreed to give battle the next day, but in the grey light before dawn, while the Scots were resting and off their guard, de Valence fell upon them in a sudden surprise attack at a place called Methven, just outside Perth. The Scottish host was scattered and broken in the half-light. Many of Bruce's men were killed or taken, and the monarch himself barely escaped, fighting his way clear and fleeing into the hills with only a remnant of his followers. The reign that had begun with such bold ceremony at Scone, only a few months before, had suffered a crushing defeat almost before it had begun, and the sovereign of Scots was now a fugitive in his own kingdom. It grew worse still. Driven into the wild mountain country of the west and north, Bruce and his dwindling band came, in the late summer, into the lands of the MacDougals of Argyll, who were kinsmen and allies of the dead Comyn, and so his sworn enemies. At a place in the high passes called Dalry, the men of Argyll fell upon the king's little company and routed it. And there is a famous tale that in the press of the fighting, as Bruce covered the retreat of his subjects with his own body, 3 of the enemy set upon him together, and that he killed all 3, but that one of them, dying, clutched at him and tore away a brooch from his cloak. A jewel that the MacDougals kept ever after, as a trophy of the day they nearly took the sovereign. Whether the tale is true in every part or not, the meaning of it is plain enough. He was now a monarch without a kingdom, a hunted man in the heather, his small army melting away, his enemies closing in from every side. The cold of autumn was coming on, and beyond it the long Highland winter, and he had nowhere safe to lay his head. He sent his women and the most precious of his companions away, to what he hoped would be safety, and he himself vanished into the wilderness, into the wet glens and the cold caves and the empty islands of the west. A fugitive with a price upon his head, the lowest that any king has ever fallen. And while he hid in the wild corners, the vengeance of Edward came down, not upon him, for they could not catch him, but upon the folk he loved, who had not been able to run as fast or hide as well. To them, and to the price they paid for his crown, we must now sorrowfully turn. When the ruler fled into the western wilderness after the disaster at Dowry, he could not keep his family with him. For women and a small child could not live the life of a hunted band moving through the mountains in the teeth of winter. So he made the hardest sort of choice, the choice to send away the common folk he most wanted to protect, in the hope that they might find safety somewhere beyond the reach of the war. He entrusted them to his younger brother Neil, a brave and steady man, and the little company that set out under Neil's care held nearly everyone Robert loved in the age. There was his queen, Elizabeth de Burgh. There was his young daughter Marjorie, still only a child. There were his sisters, Mary and Christian, women of the same fierce Bruce blood as their brother. And there was the Countess of Buchan, Isabella Macduff, who had crowned him at Scone, and who now shared the danger of all who had stood by him. Their hope was to reach the far north, and from there to take ship across the sea to Norway, where another of Robert's sisters lived as the widow of the Norwegian king, and where they might wait out the storm in safety among friends. It was a long and desperate road, through wild country in the worst season of the year, with the king's enemies hunting everywhere. And it was a measure of how low the Bruce cause had fallen, that the safest place its women could hope for lay across the northern sea, in a foreign land. They made first for the great castle of Kildrummy, in the northeast, a mighty stronghold where they might shelter and gather strength for the journey on. But the English and their Scottish allies were closing in, and Kildrummy was besieged, and so the women could not stay. Leaving Neil behind to hold the castle, they pressed on northward, hoping to reach the coast and a ship, and at last they came to the little town of Tain, on a firth of the far northeast. And there they did the only thing left to people in their plight. They sought sanctuary. They took refuge in the chapel of St. Duthac, a holy place where by the ancient law of the church no hand should be laid upon a fugitive, where even the deadliest enemy was bound to stay outside the sacred ground and let the hunted go free. For a moment perhaps they allowed themselves to hope, but the man who held that corner of Scotland was William, the Earl of Ross, an enemy of the Bruce, and he was not a man to be stopped by the holiness of a chapel. He broke the sanctuary, violating the protection of the church, as Bruce himself had done at Dumfries, and he seized the women and the child and handed them over to the officers of the English crown. So the long flight ended in betrayal at the very altar where they had hoped to be safe, and the queen, the little princess, the sisters, and the brave countess who had made a sovereign, all of them passed into the hands of Edward of England, who had every reason in the world to hate the name of Bruce, and who was not a merciful man. What was done to them is among the darkest chapters of this whole dark history, and it shows the cold and deliberate cruelty of which the great Edward was capable when his will had been crossed. Neil Bruce, the king's brother, who had held Kildrummy to the last, was taken and carried to Berwick, and there put to death as a traitor, the first of the king's brothers to die for his crown. Within the next year, 2 more of Robert's brothers, Thomas and Alexander, were captured after a landing on the western coast went wrong, and they too were put to death, so that of the king's 4 brothers, 3 were killed in the space of a little time, and only one, Edward, was left alive to stand beside him. The women suffered according to the rank and the use that Edward saw in them. The Queen, Elizabeth, was treated least harshly, for her father was Edward's friend and a leading lord whom the English king did not wish to offend, and so she was held under guard in England, confined and watched, but not abused, kept as a valuable hostage against her husband. His young daughter Marjorie, a child who had done nothing but be born a Bruce, was at first, it is said, to be shut in a cage like a wild beast. So terrible was Edward's anger, though in the end she was sent instead to be kept close in an English convent. But for 2 of the women, Edward reserved a punishment of such calculated barbarity that it shocked even that hard age. Mary Bruce, his sister, and Isabella, the Countess of Buchan who had crowned him, were singled out for a fate meant to make them living warnings to all who might think of defying the crown of England. Edward ordered that each of them be shut in a cage, a contraption of latticed wood and iron, and that the cage be hung from the wall of a castle, out in the open air, exposed to the wind and the rain and the snow, and to the eyes of every passer-by. Mary was caged in this way at the castle of Roxburgh, and Isabella, who had dared to set the crown upon the head of the Bruce, was hung in her cage from the wall of Berwick, where, it was said, she could look out across the water toward the Scotland she had served, and be a spectacle and a reproach to all who saw her. There they remained, these 2 women, not for days or weeks, but for a long time, through summer heat and winter cold, in their open cages on the castle walls, punished without mercy for their loyalty to the Bruce. It is hard, even now, across all the centuries, to read of it without a cold tightening of the heart. And somewhere out in the western wilds, hiding in caves and crossing cold sea straits in open boats, the man for whom they suffered did not even know, for stretches, whether they lived or died. He had reached for a crown, and this was the price his family paid for it. His brothers in their graves, and the women he loved, in cages and convents and prisons. A weaker man might have given up then, might have slipped away to a quiet exile and let the whole bloody business go. That he did not give up, that he rose from the very bottom of ruin and turned it all around, is the heart of why his folk have never forgotten him. But before he rose, he sank lower still, into the loneliest winter of his days, and it is there, at the very bottom, that one of the most famous of all his stories is set. The winter that followed the loss of everything was the lowest point of this man's life, and it is fitting that the most famous of all the tales told about him belongs to exactly this moment, when he had nothing left but his own stubborn refusal to lie down and die. Where exactly he spent that winter, we do not know for certain. The likeliest story is that he crossed the cold western sea and sheltered for a time on a remote island off the coast of Ireland, a wind-scoured place called Rathlin, and among the scattered isles of the Hebrides, kept alive perhaps by the loyalty of 1 or 2 Highland lords and ladies who had not abandoned him. Picture what those months must have been. A king of Scots reduced to hiding in caves and shieling huts and open boats, with a handful of faithful men in the cold and the wet and the dark of a northern winter, eating what could be hunted or fished or begged, never sure from one day to the next whether the next sail on the horizon brought friends or the men who hunted him. His crown was 3 seasons old and already a ruin. His army was scattered or dead, His brothers were being killed, his wife and sisters were in chains. The church had cast him out, and the most powerful king in the age wanted his head. There can have been few men in all of history who had more reason to despair, and it would have been the easiest thing in the world for him to slip quietly away into exile and obscurity, and let the dream of a free Scotland die with him in some foreign town. And here is where the tale comes, the one that every Scottish child has known for centuries, and whether it is sober history or later legend hardly matters, for it has become true in the way that the best stories are true, by saying something real about the man at its heart. The tale is told that Robert, at the very bottom of his fortunes, lay sheltering in a cave, sunk in despair, and that as he lay there, he watched a small spider trying to cast its thread from one point of the rock to another, to begin the spinning of its web. Again and again the spider swung out into the empty air and failed to reach its anchor, and again it gathered itself and tried once more, never giving up, until at last, after many failures, the thin thread caught and held, and the spider had its bridge and could begin to build. And Robert, watching, took the lesson to his heart, for he too had been defeated again and again, and he resolved that he would do as the spider did and try once more and not give up. Now, the careful truth is that this particular story, in this particular form, cannot be traced back to Robert's own day, and seems to have grown up in later centuries, and to have been fixed in its familiar shape by a great storyteller of Scotland long afterward. But it caught and held because it is true to the deepest thing about the man. For whatever passed in his mind during that bitter winter, the plain fact is that he did not give up. He gathered his patience and his resolve in the cold and the blackness, and when the spring came he went back to the fight, and he never stopped again until he had won. That refusal, more than any battle, is the heart of him. So in the early months of 1307, as the worst of the winter eased, the Bruce came back out of the western wilderness and slipped quietly into his own earldom of Carrick, into the land of his birth, to begin the whole struggle over again from almost nothing. He had learned hard lessons from his defeats, and he came back a changed commander, no longer willing to meet the heavy English armies in the open field where their knights and their archers would always have the advantage. Instead, he turned to the kind of war that a small and mobile force can wage against a great and lumbering one, the war of the ambush and the night raid and the sudden blow, of striking where the enemy was weak and melting away before he could strike back, of living off the land and using the hills and the bogs and the forests as allies. And as if heaven itself had grown weary of the suffering of Scotland, the greatest of all his enemies was suddenly taken from the board. In the summer of that same year, the old King of England, Edward I, the terrible hammer of the Scots, who had set out once more at the head of an army to make an end of Bruce for good, fell ill and died on the very edge of Scotland, in the marshes near Carlisle, within sight almost of the nation he had spent so much of his days trying to subdue. They say that with his dying breath he commanded that his bones be boiled clean and carried at the head of his army until the Scots were beaten. So deep ran his hatred, but his son had no stomach for such grim devotion. And the old king's body was carried south to a quiet tomb, and his war went with him into the ground. For the man who now took the English throne was a very different creature from his iron father. Edward II was not without courage, but he was weak where his father had been strong, swayed by favourites, quarrelsome with his own great barons, more interested in his pleasures and his friends than in the hard grinding work of holding down a rebellious kingdom. Where the father had been a hammer, the son was, too often, an absence, and that absence gave he the one thing he most needed, which was time. With the old king dead and the new king distracted by his own troubles at home, the pressure on Scotland slackened, and into that slackening Bruce poured all his energy. He won his first real victory not long after his return, at a place called Loudon Hill, where he chose his ground with the cunning that would become his hallmark. narrowing the field with ditches dug across the soft ground so that the heavy English cavalry could not bring its full weight to bear. And there, with his spearmen, he broke a larger force under the same Aymer de Valence who had surprised him at Methven. It was not a mighty battle as battles go, but its meaning was enormous, for it showed the Scots, and showed Bruce himself, that the English could be beaten, that the tide could turn, that the hunted fugitive of the winter might yet become a conqueror. From that small victory the whole long recovery began, and over the next years the Scottish king would wage a patient, relentless, brilliant war to win back his kingdom, piece by piece, until the day came when he was strong enough to risk everything once more in the open field. How he did it, the slow grinding reconquest of Scotland, is the next part of our story. To understand how a hunted fugitive came, in the space of a few years, to win back a whole kingdom, you have to understand the kind of war he chose to fight. For it was a war shaped by weakness turned into strength. He could never hope to match the English monarch in the open, formal warfare of the age. The English crown commanded far greater wealth, far larger armies, and above all the dreaded power of massed archers and heavy armoured knights. The war machine that had broken the Scots at Falkirk and would break them again wherever they stood to fight it on equal terms. So Bruce did not fight it on equal terms. He fought instead a war of patience and movement and cunning, the war of a smaller, poorer, hardier people against a richer and heavier enemy. He avoided the great pitched battle almost entirely. He struck by surprise and by night fell upon isolated garrisons, ambushed columns in the passes, and was gone again into the hills before the enemy could gather to answer. He lived off a nation he knew, and his enemies did not, using the bogs and the forests and the mountains as walls and hiding places. And when he took an English-held castle, as he did again and again, he did something that went against every instinct of the age. He pulled it down. Rather than garrison it and have to defend it, he slighted it, broke its walls, and made it useless, so that the English could never again use it as a base to hold down the surrounding country. Stone by stone, he was unbuilding the apparatus of the conquest. The chief weapon of his armies in the field was a formation called the schiltron, and it is worth pausing on, for it was the hedgehog of spears upon which Scottish freedom was, in the end, defended. A schiltron was a tight formation of foot soldiers, packed close together, each man bearing a long spear, the front ranks kneeling or crouching, and the rear ranks standing, so that the whole body bristled on every side with a hedge of steel points, like some great slow beast covered in quills. To a charging horseman, it was a fearful thing, for no horse will fling itself willingly upon a wall of spears, and a knight who could not break the formation could only mill about its edges and be picked off. The weakness of the schiltron had always been the arrow, for if the enemy held off and simply shot the packed ranks full of arrows, as the English had done at Falkirk, the men in the rings had no answer, and were slaughtered where they stood. The whole art of using schiltrons, then, lay in keeping the enemy's archers from doing their work, by choosing ground where they could not deploy, or by closing the distance before they could shoot, or by sweeping them from the field with a sudden stroke of one's own horseman. Mastering that art, learning when and where and how to use these spear rings, was a large part of what the Bruce taught his army in the seasons of war, and it would win him, in the end, the greatest victory of his days. He did not do it alone, for no king does anything alone. And Robert was served in these years by a band of captains as bold and as gifted as any commander could wish for. Two among them rose above the rest. One was a young man named James Douglas, the son of a lord who had died in English captivity, a dark, lean, soft-spoken man whom the English came to dread above almost any other, calling him the Black Douglas and frightening their children with his name. Douglas was a master of the surprise and the ambush and the night attack, and he took back his own family castle from its English garrison by a famous stratagem, falling upon them at their worship and leaving the spot a ruin behind him. The other was the king's own nephew, Thomas Randolph, a brilliant and chivalrous soldier whom Bruce made Earl of Moray, and who would perform the most daring feat of all the castle takings. Around these two, and the king's surviving brother Edward, a hard and headlong fighter, Robert built a band of leaders bound to him by loyalty and by shared suffering, men who had been outlaws and fugitives with him in the worst days, and who now carried his war into every corner of the kingdom. With such men, and the loyalty of a nation who had come at last to see in him their true king, Bruce was ready to move from mere survival to conquest. And conquer he did, methodically, year by year, in a campaign of reconquest that slowly turned the whole country from his enemies' hands into his own. He began by settling the score with his Scottish enemies, the Commons and their allies, who had hated him since the killing at Dumfries. He marched into the great common earldom of Buchan in the northeast and broke its lord in battle, and then did a hard and terrible thing, harrying the whole region, burning and destroying so thoroughly that the power of the Commons in the north was shattered for good, and the memory of that harrying lived on in the nation for generations. He crushed the MacDougals of Argyll, who had so nearly taken him at Dowry, defeating them in a battle fought in a narrow mountain pass where he turned their own wild country against them. With his Scottish foes broken, he turned the full weight of his war upon the English garrisons that still held the castles of the realm, and one by one those strongholds fell to him, often by daring and ingenuity rather than by costly assault. His nephew Randolph took the great castle of Edinburgh, perched on its towering rock, and thought all but impregnable, by leading a handful of men up the sheer cliff face in darkness, scaling the very crag itself, where no watch was kept, because no attack was thought possible, and falling upon the startled garrison from within. By such deeds, and by the slow, patient pressure of his war, the map of Scotland was redrawn year upon year, until by the early part of 1314, almost the whole kingdom was in Robert's hands, and only a few great castles still held out for England. The greatest of these, the mighty fortress of Stirling, standing upon its rock at the very waist of Scotland, the key to the whole country, was now the last great prize, and it was the struggle for Stirling that would bring on, at last, the open battle that Robert had avoided for 8 years, and that would decide everything. The road to the vast battle began, oddly enough, with a bargain struck by Robert's brother. Edward Bruce, that hard and headlong fighter, had been pressing the siege of Stirling Castle, and growing impatient with the slow business of starving a garrison out, he made an agreement with its English commander, a knight named Mowbray, of the kind that the chivalry of the age loved. If an English army did not come to relieve the castle by midsummer of 1314, then the garrison would surrender it without further fighting. It was a gallant sort of bargain, but it was also a reckless one, for it handed the initiative back to the enemy and set a date and a place for a reckoning. Robert, when he heard of it, is said to have been displeased, for it forced upon him the very thing he had spent 8 years avoiding. A great open battle against the full power of England on a fixed day. But the bargain was made and could not be unmade with honour, and once it was known, the English crown could not let it pass. To lose Stirling, the chief fortress of Scotland, without lifting a hand would be a humiliation no king could bear, and so Edward II, who had let his Scottish war drift for a long time, was now compelled to act. He summoned the whole strength of his realm and prepared to march north and relieve the castle, and to crush the upstart Bruce once and for all in the open field where England had always won. The army that Edward gathered was a vast and glittering host, the greatest that had come against Scotland in a generation. and the chroniclers who saw it groped for words to convey its size and splendour. There were thousands upon thousands of foot soldiers, and the dreaded companies of archers with their long bows, and above all the great mass of armoured knights and men-at-arms upon their heavy war-horses, the flower of English chivalry in their bright surcoats and their burnished steel, the most fearsome striking force in all of Western warfare. Behind them came a baggage train of immense length, the wagons and carts and pack animals carrying the food and the tents and the gear of war for so great a multitude, a moving city of supply that stretched for miles along the roads. It was an army that seemed to carry its victory with it by its sheer weight and magnificence, and many in its ranks, looking about them at that endless array of horse and steel, must have thought the coming fight a mere formality. A brief and crushing lesson to be administered to a ragged band of Scottish rebels before they were swept from history altogether. Against that host Robert the Bruce could field perhaps a third of the numbers, and almost no cavalry to speak of, and no great body of archers, only his hardy ranks of spearmen, his schiltrons, and the men who carried them, toughened by years of war, but few and poor, and facing the whole gathered might of a far richer kingdom. But Robert the Bruce had two advantages that the vast English host did not have. He had a profound knowledge of the ground, and he had a commander's eye that had been sharpened by 8 years of the hardest schooling there is. He chose his position with infinite care in the broken country south of Stirling, where the road to the castle ran through a narrow tract of firm ground hemmed in by obstacles. On one side lay dense woodland, the New Park, which would shield his men and channel the enemy. On the other, and to the front, lay the treacherous low ground of the Carse, a flat expanse threaded by the winding Bannockburn and its boggy pools and streams. Soft and waterlogged mire where heavy horses would flounder, and the great mass of an army would be cramped and crowded and unable to spread out and use its numbers. Across the firm earth by which the English must come, Robert set his men to dig, honeycombing the approaches with small pits, each the depth of a man's knee, with a sharpened stake set in the bottom, and the whole covered over with brushwood and turf, so that a charging horse would plunge its leg into the hidden hole and fall. He had chosen, in short, a battlefield that would take away every advantage of the enemy's numbers and cavalry, and force the great English host to come at him on a narrow front, on poor footing, where his spear-rings could meet them on something like equal terms. Everything now depended on whether the English could be drawn to fight on that ground, and on the steadiness of the Scottish spearmen when the storm of horse came down upon them. On the warm midsummer evening before the battle, the two armies lay close to one another in the long northern twilight, and we may imagine the thoughts on either side. In the English camp, sprawled across the Carse in its thousands, there was confidence and impatience, and the noise of a grand host at its ease, sure of the morrow. In the Scottish lines, drawn up in the wood and on the firm ground above, there was a graver mood. The quiet of men who knew exactly how much was at stake and how heavily the odds ran against them. It is recorded that on that eve there came a sudden and famous incident, when an English knight, riding ahead of his fellows and catching sight of the Scottish king out before his lines upon a small horse, lowered his lance and charged, thinking to win great glory by killing Bruce himself before the battle even began. The king was lightly armed and lightly mounted, with only the axe in his hand, and his men watched in horror as the great armoured knight thundered down upon him. But Robert held his ground, and at the last instant turned his nimble horse aside from the lance point, and rising in his stirrups, he brought his axe down upon the helmet of the charging knight with such force that he split helm and skull together, and the man fell dead, and the monarch rode quietly back to his lines. When his captains reproached him for risking everything in such a reckless moment, he is said only to have mourned the breaking of the shaft of his good axe. It was the kind of deed that fired the hearts of his men, and as the short summer night came down over the two armies, the Scots took what rest they could, knowing that with the dawn would come the trial of everything they had suffered and fought for through all the seasons. The battle opened on that first long midsummer day with the English seeking to do exactly what Robert most feared: to push past his position and break through to the besieged castle, and with the Scots fighting to stop them. While the sovereign was dealing with the rash knight who charged him, another body of English horse, a strong company of armoured riders, swung wide around the Scottish flank and tried to ride hard for Stirling along the open ground. Against them Robert sent his nephew, Thomas Randolph, with one of the spear-rings, and there followed a fight that taught both armies the lesson of the whole battle. The English knights flung themselves again and again upon the ring of spears, and again the horses balked and swerved from the hedge of steel, and the riders could find no way in, and were thrown down and killed about the edges of the formation, while the schiltrons stood firm and unbroken. It was a small action, but it was a revelation, for it showed that the dreaded English heavy horse, the war-winning weapon of the age, could be defied and beaten by steady foot soldiers with long spears who kept their nerve and their order. When the first day closed, the English had made no headway. Their attacks had been bloodily repulsed, their confidence shaken, and they had won nothing but the knowledge that the Scots would stand. And as the short night came on, they made a fateful choice. They drew back and crossed over the Bannock Burn, and made their camp for the night out upon the low, wet ground of the Carse, among the pools and the soft mud and the winding water. The worst possible ground for a leading army of horse, crowded together in a place with little room to move. That night, while the English lay uneasy and cramped upon the marshy Carse, a Scottish knight who had been in the English service came over to Robert and told him of the low morale in the enemy camp, and urged him that if he ever meant to win Scotland, now was the hour to strike. And Robert, weighing everything, made the boldest decision of his days. He had always avoided the great open battle. Now he resolved not merely to stand on the defensive and let the English break themselves upon his rings, but to attack, to take his spearmen forward at dawn across the firm ground and fall upon the crowded, ill-placed English host before it could sort itself out and bring its numbers to bear. It was a daring stroke, for foot soldiers advancing in the open were just what the English archers prayed for, but Robert had judged the field and the moment, and he trusted his men. In the grey light of the midsummer dawn, the Scottish army came out of its position and advanced, the schiltrons moving forward in good order across the open field toward the enemy, their spears levelled, and as they came, they paused and knelt for a moment in prayer, so that the watching English king, seeing them kneel, is said to have cried out in hope that the Scots were begging for mercy. A wiser man beside him answered that they were indeed asking mercy, but of God, not of England, and that these men would win or die. Then the spear rings rose and came on, and the great battle was fully joined. What followed was the unmaking of the most powerful army in those islands, and it happened because everything that should have been England's strength was turned on that ground into weakness. The schiltrons drove into the front ranks of the English, and the crowded mass of the enemy, packed too close together on the narrow wet ground between the streams, could not deploy to meet them. The great host had no room. The knights in the front could not charge to any effect, and behind them the thousands of others were jammed so tightly that they could neither advance to help nor fall back to make space, but stood crushed together in a heaving press while the Scottish spears pressed forward into them. The English archers, who alone could have broken the schiltrons by shooting them to pieces as at Falkirk, could not find clear room to do their deadly work, for their own struggling cavalry and the press of their own host were in the way. And when a body of them did get out upon the flank to shoot, Robert loosed his small force of light horsemen upon them, and scattered them before they could turn the day. So the one weapon that could have saved England was kept from its work, and the spear rings pressed on, and the vast English army began, slowly and then all at once, to come apart. Crowded, leaderless in places, unable to use its numbers, jammed against the boggy stream at its back, it lost first its order and then its heart, and the rout began. And once a medieval army broke, the breaking was terrible. The great host, with the soft carse and the deep pools of the Bannockburn behind it, had nowhere to flee, and as the panic spread, the thousands fell back upon the water and the mud. And men and horses in their armour floundered and drowned in the streams and the marsh, or were trampled in the press, or cut down by the Scots who came on among them. The chroniclers told of the burn so choked with the bodies of the fallen that men could cross it dry-shod upon them. The King of England himself, Edward II, was dragged from the field by his guard, hard-pressed and nearly taken, and fled with a small company first to the very gates of Stirling Castle, which would not shelter him, and then in headlong flight across the land, hunted by the Scots, until he reached the safety of the south, having lost his army, his honour, and the whole substance of his father's conquest in a single midsummer day. Behind him on the field lay the dead in their thousands, the flower of English chivalry, earls and barons and knights, and a vast plunder of arms and armour and gold and rich gear fell into Scottish hands. Wealth beyond anything that poor country had seen in a generation. It was the most complete victory the Scots had ever won, or ever would, and it was the work, above all, of one man's patience and judgment and nerve, of Robert the Bruce, who had been a hunted fugitive in a cave 8 years before, and was now the undoubted master of the battlefield and of his kingdom. Bannockburn did not quite end the war, for the English crown would cling to its claims for a long time yet. But from that day, there was never again any real doubt that Scotland was a free kingdom, and that Robert the Bruce was its king. And the long road from the murder at Dumfries, and the ruin of Methven, and the cages and the caves had led at last to triumph. The first fruits of the great victory were sweet beyond any plunder. For among the many English lords taken prisoner on the field was one of the greatest in the realm, the Earl of Hereford, and for such a captive, the English crown would pay almost any price. He named the price he wanted, and it was not gold. In exchange for the captured earl and certain other prisoners, he asked for the return of his own people, the wife and the daughter and the sisters who had been held in England these 8 years since the betrayal at Tain. And so it was done, and there came home to Scotland at last Queen Elizabeth, who had endured her long captivity with steadfast patience, and the king's daughter, Marjorie, who had been a small child when she was taken, and was now a young woman grown, and the king's sister Christian, and his sister Mary, who had hung so many seasons in her cage on the wall of Roxburgh. We can only imagine the meeting, after so many a season and so much suffering, when the ruler embraced again the family he had sent away into the night on that desperate flight, not knowing if he would ever see them living. It was a reunion bought with a crowned ruler's blood at Bannockburn, and it must have been one of the deepest joys of Robert's life. Yet it was shadowed too, for not all of them came home. Of the brave Countess of Buchan Isabella, who had set the crown upon his head at Scone, and paid for it with years in an open cage at Berwick. We hear nothing in the lists of those exchanged, and the silence is taken to mean that she had died in her captivity, worn out at last by the cruelty of it, and so never lived to see the triumph of the monarch she had made. Her courage had helped to begin everything, and she did not survive to share in its reward, and her name deserves to be remembered alongside his. Of the king's daughter Marjorie, returned home a young woman after a childhood spent in English keeping, there is a tender and a sorrowful tale to tell. She was now the king's only child, and while he had no son, his heir. And a husband was found for her among the great men of Scotland, a young lord named Walter, the hereditary High Steward of the realm, a brave soldier who had fought at Bannockburn. The two were married, and Marjorie soon found herself with child, and here fate dealt one of its cruel strokes. For while she was riding, heavily pregnant, she was thrown from her horse, and the fall brought on her labour. And though her child was saved, Marjorie herself died, very young, having lived through capture and captivity, and return only to be taken by an accident on a Scottish road. But the infant that was saved, a boy, was the thread upon which an extraordinary future hung. For that infant, the grandson of Robert the Bruce, through his lost daughter Marjorie, would in time come to the throne of Scotland himself as the first king of a new royal house, the House of Stuart, taking its name from his father's office of High Steward. From that line would descend, in the centuries afterward, a great procession of the kings and queens of Scotland, and in time of England too, when the two crowns were joined. So the blood of Robert the Bruce, which had so nearly been extinguished altogether in the cages and on the scaffolds, flowed on through his daughter's tragic short life into a dynasty that would shape the history of these islands for 400 years. The hunted fugitive of the heather had founded a line of kings. Meanwhile, the king's one surviving brother, Edward Bruce, that restless and headstrong warrior who had fought at his side through all the worst of it, reached for a crown of his own, and his story is a strange and tragic coda to the triumph of Bannockburn. Ireland in those days was held in part by the English crown, and many of its people chafed under that rule. And Edward Bruce conceived the bold design of crossing the sea and making himself ruler of Ireland, freeing it from England as his brother had freed Scotland, and so opening a second front in the war, and binding the Gaelic peoples of Ireland and Scotland together against the common enemy. With his brother's blessing, he led a Scottish army across to Ireland, and for a time he carried all before him, and was indeed crowned as High King of the Irish. But the venture was beset by troubles, by famine that ravaged the land in those years and turned ordinary folk against the armies that lived off it, and by the hard resistance of the English colony. And in the end, it failed. In 1318, Edward Bruce was brought to battle at a place called Faughart, and there defeated and killed. And with him died the dream of a Bruce kingdom in Ireland. So Robert lost the last of his brothers, the fourth and final one, to die in the struggle of their house. The brother who had stood with him when all the others were gone and the cause seemed lost. Of the 5 sons of the old Lord of Annandale, only Robert himself now remained alive, the survivor of a family that had spent itself almost utterly in the winning of a throne. The crown of Scotland had been bought with the lives of his brothers, one after another, and he was left to wear it alone. Great as the victory at Bannockburn had been, it did not bring the peace that Robert longed for the crown of England, though beaten, was too proud and too stubborn to admit it, and clung still to the empty claim that Scotland was his to rule and that Robert was no true king but a rebel. So the war went on, season after season, though now it was Scotland that held the whip hand and England that suffered. Robert carried the fighting into the enemy's own country, sending his hard-riding captains, the Black Douglas above all, deep into the northern counties of England in raid after raid, burning and harrying and driving off cattle, and, more profitably still, selling peace to whole districts in return for great sums of money, so that the north of England paid a bitter tribute to the sovereign it would not acknowledge. These raids were a deliberate policy, a slow and grinding pressure meant to make the war so painful and so costly to the English that their king would be forced at last to come to terms. And in 1318, Robert won back the last great prize still in English hands within Scotland itself, the wealthy border town and fortress of Berwick, which had been in English keeping ever since the dreadful slaughter there at the very beginning of the wars, more than 20 years before. With the fall of Berwick, the English were driven entirely out of Scotland, every castle and every town recovered, the conquest wholly undone. When Edward of England mustered a great effort to take Berwick back, his attempt collapsed, and a Scottish raiding force, sweeping into England to draw him off, scattered a hastily gathered English levy in a rout so one-sided, and so full of churchmen, pressed into the fighting, that men gave the affair a mocking name and laughed at it for years. Step by step, blow by blow, Robert was teaching England that the war could not be won. We should pause here over the folk who bore the true weight of all this, for behind the deeds of kings and the names of battles lay the suffering of the ordinary folk of the borderlands, on both sides of that bleeding frontier. The war made a wasteland of the nation between the two kingdoms, a broad belt of land where no one could feel safe, where the smoke of burning farms was a familiar sight on the horizon, and the driving off of a family's beasts could mean hunger or ruin. The common people of the north of England learned to dread the coming of the Scots, to watch the hills for raiders, and to gather what they could and flee to the woods or the nearest strong place when the alarm was raised. And the common people of the Scottish borders had learned the same dread a generation earlier, under the harrying of the English kings. War in that age fell heaviest not upon the armoured lords, who might be ransomed if taken, but upon the unarmed and the poor, the farmer and his family, whose whole small world of byre and field and cottage could be swept away in an afternoon by men who would never know or care what they had destroyed. The freedom that Robert the Bruce was winning was a real and a precious thing, and his own people honoured him for it. But it is right to remember that it was bought, like all things of worth, with a great deal of ordinary suffering by folk whose names no chronicle records, and that the long turning of his war was felt, far more than in any hall or council, in the cold dread of country folk watching the smoke rise on a distant hill. It was against this background of unending war that there was drawn up, in 1320, one of the most remarkable documents in the whole history of these islands. A letter that has echoed down the 7 centuries since, with a power its writers can scarcely have foreseen. The Scots, weary of a war that England would not end, and shadowed still by the sentence of excommunication that hung over their king, resolved to appeal over the head of the English crown to the highest authority in Christendom, the Pope at Rome, and to lay before him the justice of their cause. So the earls and barons and the whole community of the realm of Scotland set their names and their seals to a letter written at the Abbey of Arbroath, addressed to the Holy Father, asserting the ancient independence of their kingdom and begging him to recognise their king and to press the King of England to leave them in peace. It is known to history as the Declaration of Arbroath, and it is famous above all for one ringing passage in which the Scots declared that they fought not for glory, nor for riches, nor for honours, but for freedom alone, which no good man gives up except with his life. And more startling still was another passage in which these lords declared that they followed Robert as their sovereign because he had won them their freedom, but that should he ever falter and seek to make them subject to England, they would cast him out and choose another to rule in his place and defend their liberty, for it was not to any one man, but to freedom itself that they had given their allegiance. It was an astonishing thing to say to a pope about a reigning monarch. The idea that a monarch held his crown not by his own right alone, but in trust for the freedom of his folk, and that the community of the realm stood above even the ruler himself. Whether Robert himself approved every word of it, we cannot know, but it was sent in his cause, and it spoke for his kingdom, and it remains one of the noblest statements of the love of liberty that the medieval age ever produced. There was one enemy that no battle could defeat, and that hung over Robert the Bruce through nearly the whole of his reign. And to feel its weight, we have to enter for a moment into the medieval mind, which is in some ways the hardest thing of all to recover across the centuries. For the common folk of that age, the church was not one institution among many, but the very road to heaven, and to be cut off from it was the most terrible fate that could befall a soul. Robert lay under the sentence of excommunication, pronounced upon him for the shedding of Comyn's blood before the altar at Dumfries, and that sentence meant, in the belief of his time, that he was severed from the body of the faithful, barred from the sacraments that were the channels of God's grace, and in mortal danger, should he die unreconciled, of the everlasting fire. It is a measure of how deep the longing for freedom ran in Scotland that the Scottish bishops stood by him in spite of it, absolving and supporting their king in defiance of Rome. But the shadow of the ban was real, and it was used against him relentlessly by his enemies, who painted him to all of Christendom as a sacrilegious murderer with whom no Christian king need keep faith. To win the Pope's recognition, then, was not merely a matter of politics. It touched the deepest fears of the age, the fate of the soul, the standing of the monarch before God, the legitimacy of the whole Scottish cause in the eyes of heaven. The long diplomatic struggle to lift the ban and to gain the Holy Father's blessing was in its way as hard fought as any campaign, waged with letters and embassies and appeals over many a season, and the Declaration of Arbroath was one of its weapons. And slowly, as the years passed and the Scots held firm and the justice of their cause became harder to deny, the great prize was won. The Pope came in time to recognise Robert as the rightful king of an independent Scotland, and the dread sentence of excommunication was at last lifted from him, so that the sovereign who had been an outcast from the church for the killing at Dumfries was received back into its peace and could face the end of his days when it came reconciled to God and to the faith of his fathers. The winning of that reconciliation must have brought him a relief deeper than any of his victories in the field, for it touched the part of him that no army could reach. Meanwhile, in the very years of these diplomatic triumphs, the king's own house was at last made secure in the way that mattered most to a medieval monarch by the birth of a son. For years, Robert and his Queen Elizabeth had no living son between them, only daughters, and the succession to the hard-won throne hung uncertain, with no male heir of the king's body to carry on the line. Then, in 1324, Queen Elizabeth bore the ruler a son, a boy named David, and the future of the dynasty was assured. After all the blood and the suffering, after the loss of his brothers and the death of his first wife and the early death of his daughter Marjorie, the monarch had a son to follow him, and the crown he had won at such a fearful cost would pass to his own child. The last act of the struggle came with a change of kings in England. The feeble Edward II, who had fled the field at Bannockburn and clung so long and so vainly to his father's claims, was at last overthrown by his own wife and her allies, deposed from his throne, and soon after secretly done to death. And the English crown passed to his young son, who became Edward III, a boy ruled for the time being by a regency. The Scots, sensing that the moment had come, pressed their advantage with one last hard campaign, raiding into England and so thoroughly outmanoeuvring the young king's army that the boy king is said to have wept with rage and helplessness as the Scots slipped away unbeaten, having even raided into the royal camp itself in the gloom. Worn down and unable to win, the English government at last bowed to the truth that Robert the Bruce had been driving home for more than 20 years. In the year 1328, by a treaty agreed at Edinburgh and confirmed at Northampton, the Crown of England formally renounced all claim to the overlordship of Scotland and recognised Robert the Bruce as king of a free and independent kingdom. And the war that had begun with the death of a sovereign on a stormy road more than 40 years before was at last over. To seal the peace, the king's small son David, still only a child, was betrothed to a young sister of the English king, so that the two royal houses, which had shed so much blood, were joined in marriage, and, it was hoped, in lasting friendship. He had won everything. He had taken a conquered and kingless country, fallen lower than any king before him, and raised it up into a free realm, recognized by England and by the Church, secure in its independence, with an heir of his own body to follow him. The work of his days was complete, and he had little time left to enjoy it. It is easy, with a man so bound up in war, to forget that the winning of battles is only the smaller part of a crowned ruler's work, and that the harder and longer labour is the governing of a kingdom in peace. He spent more than 20 years fighting, but he had not neglected the other and quieter task. And in the seasons after Bannockburn, as the pressure of the war eased, he gave more and more of himself to the rebuilding of his shattered realm. For Scotland, after a generation of war and conquest and civil strife, was in many ways a broken country, its government in ruins, its records scattered or carried off to England, its lands laid waste, its old machinery of law and revenue fallen into disuse. Robert set himself patiently to mend it. He held parliaments and made laws, settled the succession upon his heirs, and rewarded the men who had stood by him with the lands of those who had not, binding the nobility to him and to the new order he had founded. He restarted the slow, unglamorous business of royal government, the collecting of revenues and the keeping of accounts and the doing of justice, the work without which a crown is only an ornament. He sought, after all the years of devastation, to give his subjects the one thing they had not known in a generation, which was peace, the ordinary blessing of a settled land where a man might plough his field and raise his children without watching the horizon for smoke. It was less glorious than Bannockburn, but it was the truer measure of a monarch, and in it Robert showed himself as patient and as capable as he had been in war. And as the burden of the fighting at last fell away, the aging king made for his own comfort a place of rest, and the picture we have of his final years there is a gentle one, all the more touching for the storms that had gone before. He built on the northern shore of the Clyde, at a place called Cardross, not a grim fortress, but a comfortable manor house, a country dwelling fit for a sovereign who had earned his ease, and there he spent the close of his life. The records that survive of that manor let us see it almost as if we were walking through it. There were the king's chambers and the queen's with glazed windows to let in the light, a luxury in that age. There was a chapel for his devotions, and kitchens and brewhouses and bakehouses to feed the royal household, and a great hall where he kept his court. Out of doors there were gardens, and a park for the hunting that he loved, and a place where his hunting birds were kept, his falcons and his hawks. For hawking was among the chief pleasures of a great man, and the sovereign, who had hidden in caves, now flew his birds over his own free country in the evening light. And there was a detail that speaks of the man perhaps more than anything else, for at Cardross the ruler kept a ship, a vessel of his own, and he would go aboard her and sail upon the broad firth of the Clyde and among the islands of the west, the very western seas through which he had once fled as a hunted fugitive in an open boat with his enemies at his heels. Now he sailed them as a crowned ruler at peace, in his own ship, upon his own water, in his own kingdom. There is something deeply moving in that image, the old warrior. His fighting done, sailing quietly among the isles in the long northern evenings, and one hopes that he found there, at the end, a measure of the peace he had given his folk. For he was growing old before his time, worn out by the hardships of a life such as few men have ever endured. The years in the saddle and the years in the heather, the wounds and the privations and the endless campaigning, and his health was failing. We do not know with any certainty what sickness it was that took hold of him in his last years. The English chroniclers, no friends to him, said that he was struck down by leprosy, the dreaded wasting disease that the medieval age feared above almost all others and called the unclean sickness. And the tale has clung to his name ever since. but the Scottish accounts say nothing of leprosy, and many who have studied his life find it hard to believe. For a man so afflicted could scarcely have done the deeds that Robert went on doing, ruling and travelling, and holding his court, and fathering his children, in the very season when the disease was supposed to have him in its grip. It may have been some other illness, a slow decline of the heart or the body brought on by the sheer accumulated toll of his hard life, a stroke, or some sickness whose nature the medicine of that age could not name and ours cannot recover. Whatever it was, it bore him down through his last seasons, and he must have known, as the strength ebbed out of the body that had carried him through so much, that his time was drawing toward its close. He had one great longing left unfulfilled, a debt of the soul that he had never been able to pay, and as he felt death approaching, his mind turned to it, and to how, even in dying, he might at last discharge it. To understand the strange and beautiful thing that Robert the Bruce asked for on his deathbed, we have to understand the hold that one idea had upon the imagination of his age, the idea of the crusade, the holy war to recover the sacred places of the Christian faith in the distant East. For 3 centuries the knighthood of Christendom had dreamed of and fought for the Holy Land, the nation where their Saviour had lived and died. And to take the cross and journey there to fight the enemies of the faith was held to be the highest and most cleansing act a Christian warrior could perform, a pilgrimage of the sword that washed away the sins of a lifetime. By Robert's day, the great age of the Crusades was passing. The Christian holds in the Holy Land had nearly all been lost, and the dream was fading into memory, but it still burned in the hearts of pious fighting men, and it burned in Robert's. For he carried upon his conscience, all his days long, the dark stain of the deed at Dumfries, the blood shed before the altar, the murder in the holy place, that had cost him his peace with the church, and he must have feared, endangered his very soul. And he had made a vow, as men did, that one day, when his wars were won and his kingdom was safe, he would take the cross and go to the Holy Land and fight there against the enemies of Christ, and so do penance for his great sin, and find peace for his troubled conscience. It was the one debt he had never been able to pay. The wars had gone on too long, and the kingdom had needed him too much. And now, at the very end, with his realm at last free and at peace, his body was failing, and he knew that he would never be strong enough to make the long and perilous journey himself. The vow would go unfulfilled, and the longing of his soul unanswered, unless he could find some other way. And so, as he lay dying at Cardross, he summoned to him the men he most trusted, and chief among them the companion of all his hardest years, Sir James Douglas, the Black Douglas, the bold and faithful captain who had been with him since the worst days and had carried his war into England again and again. And to Douglas, the dying lord made his last and strangest request. Since he could not himself carry his body to the Holy Land to fulfill his vow, he asked that after his death his heart should be taken from his body and embalmed, and that Douglas should carry that heart with him on a crusade against the enemies of the faith and bear it into battle, so that the heart of Robert the Bruce, which had never been able to make the journey in life, might be carried to the wars of the cross in death, and his vow be discharged at last. It was a request that belonged wholly to the spirit of that age, half pious and half romantic, the dying wish of a soldier king who had spent the whole of his days in war, and now wished his very heart to die in the holiest war of all. Douglas, it is said, wept to hear it, and swore upon his knighthood that he would do as his king asked, that he would carry the heart of his lord against the enemies of Christ as faithfully as he had followed Robert himself through all the years of their struggle. And so the dying king's mind was set at rest. He had won his kingdom, secured his line, made his peace with the church, and now he had found, even in death, a way to keep the vow that had weighed upon his soul. There was nothing left to do but to die, and to die, after all that violent and wandering life, in his own bed, in his own house, in his own free country, was itself a kind of victory that for many years had seemed impossible. He had time in those last days to set his earthly house in order as carefully as he had set his soul. He named his young son David as his heir, the child who would be king after him, and he appointed the most trusted of his captains, the loyal Randolph and others, to govern the kingdom as guardians during the boy's childhood, so that the realm he had bled to free should not fall back into the chaos of a disputed succession. He gave his last instructions, made his last gifts, spoke his last words to the men and women gathered about him, and prepared himself, in the manner of a devout man of his time, for the passage that all must make. He had seen so much death in his days, the death of his brothers on English scaffolds, of his first wife in childbed, of his daughter on a Scottish road, of countless men on a dozen battlefields. And now he came to face his own with the same steady courage he had shown through all of it. The man who had been hunted through the heather with a price on his head, who had hidden in caves and crossed cold seas in open boats, who had risked his soul and his life and the lives of all he loved upon the throw for a crown, lay quietly now in his manor by the Clyde, his work done, waiting for the end. And in the early summer of the year 1329, a month short of his 55th birthday, with his lords about him and his soul at peace, Robert the Bruce, King of Scots, died. The death of a monarch was in that age a great and solemn ceremony, and it began in the soul before it touched the body. A devout man of Robert's time prepared for their end as for the most important journey of his life, for beyond it lay, in the belief of the age, the judgment of God and the passage of the Spirit. He would have made his last confession and received the final rites of the Church, the holy oil and the last communion, so that he might go cleansed and reconciled, and we may be sure that for Robert, so long an outcast from the Church, and now received back into its peace, this reconciliation was the most precious thing of all at the end. Around the deathbed of a sovereign gathered the great men of the realm and the priests and the household, to witness his passing and to hear his last commands, and to begin at once the great work of prayer on his behalf. For the medieval mind did not believe that death was the end, or that the dead were beyond all help. It believed that the soul must pass through a long cleansing before it could come at last to heaven, and that the prayers and the masses of the living could ease and shorten that passage. And so the death of a notable man set in motion an immense and lasting labour of prayer on his behalf, the founding of chantries, the giving of alms to the poor who would pray for him in return, the saying of masses without number for the repose of his soul. The richer and greater the man, the vaster this engine of prayer that his passing set turning, and for a crowned ruler it turned on a kingly scale. So when Robert the Bruce died at Cardross in the early summer of 1329, the whole apparatus of a royal passing was set in motion for him. And then there was done what he had asked for, the deed that would carry his name into one of the most famous stories in all of Scottish history. His body was opened, and his heart was taken from it, and the heart was embalmed and sealed within a casket of silver, to be carried by Sir James Douglas on the crusade that the monarch himself could never make. His other inward parts were reverently buried in a church near Cardross, and his body, embalmed and wrapped, was made ready for its last journey, not to the Holy Land, but to the ancient resting place of the kings of Scots. With great ceremony and amid the mourning of the realm he had freed, the body of the sovereign was carried across the land to the Abbey of Dunfermline, the great church where the kings and queens of Scotland had long been laid to rest, where his royal ancestors slept, and where the Holy Queen Margaret of old was honoured. There, before the high altar, in the heart of that ancient and sacred place, the fallen king was buried with all the solemnity due to the deliverer of his nation, and a fine tomb was raised over him. and the prayers of his folk rose for the repose of the soul of the ruler who had given them back their freedom. It was a fitting rest for his remains among the kings of his line in the holiest of Scottish churches. But his heart was not at rest. His heart was about to set out upon the strangest and most romantic journey of all, into a far country, to a battlefield against the enemies of the faith, in the keeping of the most faithful of all his men. For Sir James Douglas was as good as his word, and the tale of what he did with the heart of his lord is one that has been told and retold in Scotland for 700 years, and it has lost none of its power. He took the silver casket with the embalmed heart of Robert the Bruce, and it is said that he hung it about his neck on a chain, so that he carried his lord's heart upon his own breast. And he gathered a company of knights and set out by sea from Scotland, bound for the wars of the Cross. The most direct road to fight the enemies of the faith no longer lay in the distant Holy Land, which was by then almost wholly lost, but in the nearer country of Spain, where the Christian kingdoms of the north waged their war against the Moorish realms of the south, against the followers of a different faith who had held part of that peninsula for centuries. There the crusading spirit still found a field, and there Douglas turned, to spend the heart of his king and his own life in battle against the unbeliever. He came into Spain and was honourably received, and joined himself to the army of a Christian king who was marching against the Moors, and so the heart of Robert the Bruce came at last, after all, to a holy war. Carried on the breast of the bravest of his knights, far from the cold green hills of Scotland, under the hot sun of the Spanish south. And it was there, on a Spanish battlefield, that the tale reached its strange and fitting end. The battle came at a place called Teba, in the hot and rugged country of the Spanish south, where the Christian army met the forces of the Moors, and there James Douglas fought his last fight. He was a soldier to the marrow, schooled in the bold and headlong warfare of the Scottish hills, and in the swirl and confusion of the battle, whether carried away by his own fierce courage or riding to the rescue of a hard-pressed comrade, he found himself cut off. Swept forward with only a few of his knights into the midst of the enemy, surrounded and beyond hope of rescue. And here the tale gives us the moment that has fixed itself forever in the memory of Scotland. Seeing that he was trapped and that his end was upon him, Douglas is said to have taken from his neck the silver casket that held the heart of Robert the Bruce, and to have flung it ahead of him into the thick of the enemy, into the very place where the fighting was hottest, and to have cried out to it words that have echoed down the centuries, bidding the brave heart go forward as it had always been wont to do in life, and swearing that Douglas would follow it or die. And then he spurred forward after the heart of his king into the press of the enemy, and there, fighting to reach it, James Douglas was killed. It was an end wholly in keeping with everything that had gone before. The faithful captain following his lord's heart into death, as he had followed his lord through every danger in life. And it sealed the bond between the two men, the monarch and his knight, in a way that no peaceful death ever could have done. After the battle, the companions of Douglas who had survived searched the stricken field and found the body of their leader, and beside it, or near it, the silver casket with the heart of the sovereign. Both recovered from among the slain, and now there was nothing left to do but to carry them home. The crusade was over, the vow in some sense fulfilled, the heart of Robert the Bruce having been borne, as he had wished, into battle against the enemies of the faith, even if it had not reached the distant Holy Land of which he had dreamed. The surviving knights gathered up the bones of the good Douglas and the casket, holding the heart of the ruler, and they made the long, sad journey back across the sea to Scotland, bearing home the heart that had been carried so far, and the captain who had died carrying it. The heart of Robert the Bruce was brought at last to its final resting place, not at Dunfermline with his body, but at the Abbey of Melrose, in the green country of the Scottish borders, a house that the monarch had loved and favoured in his days. There the heart was buried, and there it has lain, beneath the soil of the abbey, through all the centuries since, while his body lay far off at Dunfermline, among the kings of his line. The two parts of him resting apart in the nation he had freed, as if even in death the restless heart of the Bruce would not lie quiet with the rest of him, but kept its own place, in its own corner of Scotland. And over the good Douglas, carried home and laid to rest in his own country, his subjects mourned a knight who had been, in faithfulness and courage, very nearly the equal of the sovereign he served. So passed Robert the Bruce out of the world of the living and into the longer life of memory, and it is worth standing back, now that the tale is told, to see what manner of thing he had done with his 53 years. He had been born into a settled and peaceful kingdom, the son of a great house, with no greater destiny in prospect than the comfortable lordship of broad estates. He had lived to see that peaceful world shattered, his homeland conquered and unmade, its crown carried off, and its very name struck from the roll of kingdoms. He had shed blood before an altar, and seized a crown in defiance of the church and the most powerful king of the age, and had paid for it with the lives of his brothers and the long suffering of the women he loved. He had fallen lower than any king before him, a hunted outlaw in the heather with a price upon his head, and had risen from that ruin by sheer patience and courage and cunning to defeat the whole gathered might of England on the field of Bannockburn. And he had spent the seasons afterward grinding out, blow by blow and letter by letter, the final recognition of everything he had fought for, until he died at last a crowned and anointed king, reconciled to his church, secure in his line, the master of a free and independent kingdom that had seemed, when he began, to be gone forever. Few men in all of history have ever travelled so far, from such depths to such heights, or wagered so much and won. And what he won was not for himself alone, nor even for his line, but for a whole people. The freedom that the men at Arbroath had said was worth more than glory or riches or honours. The freedom for which alone they wrote. A good man gives up his life. We should not pass on without giving their due to a group of men who stood by Robert the Bruce at the very moment of his greatest peril, and who risked as much for him as any soldier, though they never carried a sword. These were the bishops of Scotland, and chief among them the old Bishop of Glasgow, Robert Wishart, and the Bishop of St. Andrews, William Lamberton, churchmen who threw the whole weight of their sacred office behind the new king, at the hour when to do so was to court ruin and damnation alike. Remember the position they were in. Robert had killed a man before an altar, the blackest of sacrilege, the very crime that the church existed to abhor, and the Pope at distant Rome would soon pronounce against him the dread sentence of excommunication. By every rule of their calling, the bishops should have shunned him, cast him out, denied him the sacraments and the comfort of the church. Instead, they did the opposite. Wishart, who had hated the English conquest with a fierce and patriotic heart for years, gave the ruler absolution for the deed, brought out the royal robes he had kept hidden against just such a day, and helped to set the crown upon his head. Lamberton lent his great authority to the cause. They defied their own church and their own pope for the sake of the freedom of their country, and they paid for it. For both were seized by the English and held in close and harsh confinement for years. It was an extraordinary thing for men of religion to do, to place the cause of their nation above the commands of Rome, and the freedom of Scotland owed as much to their courage as to any victory in the field. When we picture the lonely king at Scone, with almost nothing, we should picture beside him these brave old churchmen, staking their souls and their liberty upon him. And we should remember that the winning of Scotland was the work not only of warriors, but of bishops who would not bow, And since so much of his life was spent in war, let us spend a few quiet moments imagining the actual gear and the look of a fighting man of his age. For it is part of entering his age to see it as it truly was. Down to the weight of the steel a man carried on his body. A great lord or knight going to battle in those days was a walking fortress of metal and leather, and the arming of him was a slow and careful business. Over a padded undergarment he wore his mail, a shirt of many thousands of small iron rings linked one through another, supple as cloth and yet proof against a sword's edge, heavy on the shoulders and falling to the knee. And over the years of Robert's life, the smiths were learning to add to this plates of solid steel at the shoulder and the knee and the shin, the beginning of the full plate armour that would come after. Upon his head went the helm, a heavy thing of steel that turned a blow, but stifled the breath and narrowed the sight to a slit. He bore a shield upon his arm, painted with the colours and the device of his house, by which he might be known in the press of battle, where every face was hidden. And for weapons there was the long sword at his side, and the lance for the charge on horseback, and the axe and the mace and the dagger for the close and desperate work when the lines came together. The common foot soldier, the man of the schiltron, went far more lightly armed, with perhaps a quilted coat or a few pieces of mail if he was lucky, a steel cap, and above all his long spear, the weapon upon which the whole Scottish way of war was built. To go into battle so burdened, in the heat and the terror and the deafening noise, swinging heavy steel until the arm could barely lift, was a labour we can scarcely imagine, and the men who did it, lord and commoner alike, were hard beyond anything our softer age produces. When you picture Robert the Bruce bringing his axe down upon the helm of the charging knight on the eve of Bannockburn, picture the weight and the heat and the sheer brutal effort of it, and you will feel a little of what the warfare of that age truly was. There is one more shadow from his story worth understanding, for it explains much of the bitterness that dogged him to the end, and that is the terrible thing called the blood feud, which ruled the relations of the great families of that age more powerfully than any law. When Robert the Bruce struck down John Comyn before the altar at Dumfries, he did not merely remove a rival. He plunged the whole house of Bruce into a deadly and undying enmity with the whole vast house of Comyn and all its kindred and allies, an enmity of the most implacable kind. For in that world, the killing of a man laid upon his family a sacred duty of vengeance that could be discharged only in blood. The Comyns were one of the mightiest families in all of Scotland, with branches and allies spread across the north. And from the moment of the murder, they were Bruce's sworn and bitter enemies, bound by the deepest obligation their world knew to bring him down and avenge their slain kinsman. This is why so many Scots fought against their own would-be king, why the early years of his reign were as much a civil war among Scots as a war against England, why he had to harry the Comyn lands so mercilessly to break their power. It was not mere politics. It was the working out of a blood feud, the most binding and most savage force in that society, in which an injury to the family was an injury that cried out across the generations for an answer in kind. Robert had loosed that force against himself by the dagger at Dumfries, and he lived under its shadow for the rest of his days, fighting not only the King of England, but the undying vengeance of a great Scottish house that he himself had wronged in the holiest of places. To understand him is to understand that he made, in that one violent moment, not only a throne for himself, but an enemy that would never forgive and never rest, and that much of his suffering flowed from that single, fateful, irrecoverable stroke. It is impossible to think long about Robert the Bruce without thinking also of the other man whose name is bound up with his in the freeing of Scotland, the man who came before him and lit the fire that Bruce would carry to victory. William Wallace and Robert the Bruce were as different as two men could be, and the difference tells us much about the age they lived in. Wallace was not a great lord, but a man of lesser rank, a knight of modest estate who rose from outside the circle of the mighty, and it was he, when the great nobles of Scotland had mostly bowed their heads to the conqueror, who would not bow, who gathered the common folk and the lesser men, and struck the first bold blows for freedom. He won his famous victory, and ruled briefly as guardian, and when his rising was broken, he would not submit even then, but kept up the fight as a hunted man, until he was betrayed and carried to a cruel death, refusing to the very end to acknowledge the English king as his lord. He died for the cause without ever seeing it won. Bruce, by contrast, was born at the very summit of the nobility, a man with a claim to the throne itself, who spent years calculating and shifting and waiting before he committed himself wholly, and who then carried the struggle through to the triumph that Wallace had not lived to see. The one was the spark, and the other the flame, the one a martyr, and the other a victor, the one a man of ordinary folk who died for freedom, the other a monarch who won it. Scotland has never had to choose between them, and has loved them both. The commoner who would not bend, and the noble who would not give up. And it is right that it should, for between them, in their different ways and their different stations, they gave their country back to itself. And we should set Robert the Bruce too, in the wider world of his day, for Scotland was never an island entire of itself, cut off from the great currents of medieval Europe, but a kingdom among kingdoms, caught up in the rivalries and the friendships of the whole continent. The struggle with England drove Scotland, of necessity, into the arms of England's great enemy across the sea, the Kingdom of France, and there was forged in those years a bond between the two countries that would last for centuries. The alliance that men came to call the Old Alliance, by which Scotland and France stood together against the common foe, and Scottish soldiers fought in French wars, and French support flowed north to Scotland. It was a friendship of mutual interest, two countries on either side of England, leaning upon one another against the power between them. But it was real, and it was lasting. And it drew Scotland into the affairs of Europe and Europe into the affairs of Scotland. Robert, in his diplomacy, played upon this wider stage, seeking the friendship of France and the recognition of the Pope at Rome, understanding that the freedom of his small northern kingdom depended not only upon spears at Bannockburn, but upon the goodwill and the calculation of distant powers. He was no mere wild warrior of the heather for all his years as an outlaw, but a sovereign who understood the world he moved in, who could fight a battle and write a letter to a pope, who knew that a kingdom is held by diplomacy as much as by the sword. The Scotland he left behind was a recognized member of the family of European nations, its independence acknowledged from Rome to Paris to London, its place in the world secure. There is a question that hangs over the memory of any such man, the question of what kind of person he really was, behind the legend and the centuries of honour. And it is not an easy one to answer. For Robert the Bruce was a figure of his hard age and not of ours, and there were shadows in him as well as light. He could be ruthless, and was. He killed a rival before the altar of a church, a deed of cold violence and sacrilege that horrified his own world and that no telling can make clean. He shifted his allegiance more than once in his early years, serving the English when it suited him and the Scots when it suited him, in a way that his enemies called treachery and that even his friends might find hard to defend, until the day he committed himself wholly and forever. He harried whole regions without mercy when his cause required it, and brought fire and ruin to the lands of his enemies. He was, in short, a medieval king, schooled in a brutal age, who did the brutal deeds that the winning and holding of a crown demanded in that age. And yet alongside the ruthlessness there was something else, a greatness of spirit that won and held the love of brave men through the worst that fortune could do. A patience and a courage and a refusal to despair that lifted a whole people with him, and at the end a true piety and a longing for the peace of his soul. He was not a simple hero, but a real and complicated man, capable of cold violence and of deep faith, of calculation and of magnificent courage. And perhaps it is exactly that complexity that makes him so enduringly human and so worth remembering. Across all the centuries between his age and ours, one of the deepest truths about Robert the Bruce's story, and one of the most moving, is the quality of the loyalty he inspired in the men who served him. For no king wins a kingdom by his own hand alone, and the strength of the Bruce lay always in the devotion of the men who stood with him. To understand it, we have to enter into the bond that lay at the very heart of that society, the bond between a lord and the men who followed him, which was the thread from which the whole fabric of the age was woven. A man gave his lord his service and his sword, and if it came to it, his life. And in return, the Lord gave his man protection and reward, and a place in the world, and the whole thing was sealed with solemn oaths, and held together by a code of faith that, when it was honoured, could be stronger than any chain. In the easy times, such bonds are cheap, and many a man swears loyalty who will melt away when the weather turns. What is remarkable about the followers of the Bruce is that so many of them held faith with him through the very worst that could come, when there was nothing to be gained by it but suffering and death, when he was a hunted outlaw with a price on his head and a sentence of damnation upon his soul. And to be known as his man was to invite the scaffold, the Black Douglas, who would carry his heart into battle and die for it on a Spanish field. The king's nephew Randolph, who climbed a cliff in the blackness to take a castle for him. The brothers who went one after another to their deaths. The countess who crowned him and paid for it in a cage. The Highland chiefs who sheltered him in the wild winter, when his cause seemed dead. These were not men and women bound to a winning side by hope of gain. They were bound to a man and a cause they believed in, through ruin and into triumph. And the love they bore him is itself a kind of testimony to what he was. For such loyalty is not given to small men. And there is in his story too an idea that reaches far beyond his own age and speaks to ours, the idea of freedom itself and what it is worth and where it truly rests. It is something that the Scots, in their long defiance, felt their way toward more boldly than almost anyone else alive in that age, and it is worth dwelling upon in the quiet of the night, for it ran centuries ahead of its time. Think how startling it was, in an age of monarchs who claimed to rule by the will of heaven alone, answerable to no power on earth, for a whole community to hold that its ruler sat upon his throne, not as his own possession, but in trust on behalf of his people and their liberty. And that should he ever betray that trust, the people themselves might set him aside and raise up another to defend them. Their deepest allegiance, in other words, was given not to any one man, but to the liberty of their nation, and the man was honoured only so long as he served it. It is a notion that would take centuries more to work itself fully out in the history of nations. The conviction that authority rests at last, not in the ruler, but in the community of the ruled, and that even a crowned sovereign is the servant and not the master of the freedom of his people. That such a thought should have taken shape in a cold northern realm 700 years ago, in defence of the cause of Robert the Bruce, is one of the quiet wonders of his story, and one of the truest measures of what his struggle came, in the end, to mean. We should not pretend that the men who made that proud declaration lived up to it in every particular, or that medieval Scotland was some shining commonwealth of liberty, for it was a hard and unequal world, where the great ruled and the small obeyed, and the freedom that was spoken of was the freedom of the nation from a foreign master, not the freedom of every man within it. But ideas have a way of outliving the narrow purposes for which they are first conceived, of growing in the telling and reaching further than their makers ever meant. And the idea set down at Arbroath, that freedom is worth more than life, and that even kings are its servants, has echoed down the centuries and been claimed by people the writers never imagined in causes they never dreamed of. It is part of what makes the tale of Robert the Bruce more than the tale of one man's ambition and one kingdom's war, and lifts it into something that still speaks to the human longing to be free. He fought, in the plainest sense, to make himself a monarch and to drive a conqueror out of his nation. But what he and his people did in the doing of it, the words they found and the stand they made, became something larger than themselves. A chapter in the long and never finished story of the love of liberty. And that is why, across all the centuries, his name still carries the weight it does. Let us linger a while on the country and the climate that made him. For Robert the Bruce was shaped, as all men are, by the hard, particular world he moved through. And his was a world of long darkness and bitter cold for half of every year. The Scotland of his day knew nothing of the comforts we take for granted against the winter. When the short days came, and the light failed early, and the wind came down off the mountains, with the smell of snow in it, there was only the fire and the candle and the thick walls of stone, or the smoke-filled dark of a turf-roofed hut to keep the cold at bay, and the nights were very long. And the work of simply staying warm and fed through the dead of the year was a labour that filled much of life. It was a country where a man learned endurance from the cradle, where the week did not last, where the rhythm of the seasons ruled everything, the brief intense summer of growth and gathering, and the grey siege of winter that had to be survived. And it was this hard schooling, as much as anything, that made the Scots the soldiers they were, and that made possible the kind of war that Bruce waged. For his was a war fought in and through that harsh land, and that harsh weather, a war of men who could march and fight and sleep out in conditions that would have destroyed a softer people, who could vanish into the winter hills where no comfortable southern army could follow, who could endure the cold and the wet and the hunger because they had been enduring such things all their lives. When Robert hid through that desperate winter in the caves and the islands of the West, he was suffering, yes, but he was suffering in a country and a climate he knew in his bones, among a folk bred to hardship. And that was one of the secret strengths of his cause. The very harshness of Scotland, which made it a poor and difficult country, made it also a land very hard to conquer, a place that swallowed up invading armies and wore them down, and gave its own hardy sons the endurance to outlast a richer and softer foe. And how, you might wonder, lying there in the night, do we know any of this at all, across so vast a gulf of years? How does the story of a man who died 7 centuries ago come down to us, so that it can be told again tonight? Part of the answer is that his own people, who loved him, took care that he should not be forgotten, and within the lifetime of those who had known him, or known men who knew him, his deeds were gathered up and set down, and made into a great and stirring poem, a long telling in verse of the whole story of his wars, his fall and his rising and his triumph, composed by a Scottish churchman a couple of generations after his death. That poem fixed the memory of Robert the Bruce for all the centuries that followed, carrying down the famous scenes, the killing at Dumfries and the hiding in the wilds, and the victory at Bannockburn and the carrying of the heart, in words that Scots would read and recite and pass on from age to age. Around that written memory there grew the softer, wilder growth of folk tale and legend, the story of the spider in the cave and the rest. The stories that may not be sober history, but that carried, in their way, a truth about the man, and kept his name alive in the mouths of ordinary people who never read a chronicle. And the very land kept his memory too, for there was the field of Bannockburn where the great battle had been won, and there was the Abbey of Dunfermline where his body lay among the kings, and there was the Abbey of Melrose where his heart was buried, places a man could go to and stand in and remember, anchoring the story to the solid earth of Scotland. So the memory of Robert the Bruce was kept, in poem and in legend and in stone, and handed down the long generations, growing and changing as such memories do, until it became one of the great founding stories of a nation. The tale a whole people told itself about where its freedom came from and what it had cost. And there is something fitting in that, for Robert had understood, better perhaps than any king of his age, that a kingdom lives not only in its battles and its treaties, but in the hearts and the memories of its people, in the stories they tell and the things they will not forget. He had fought, after all, not merely for a crown of gold, but for the idea of Scotland itself, for the right of a nation to be themselves and to rule themselves, and a folk is held together, in the end, by what it remembers in common, by winning his war and by the manner of his winning it, by the suffering and the courage and the strange romance of the carried heart. He gave his nation a tale worth remembering, a tale that would knit Scots together and steel them in hard times for centuries to come. He became, in dying, more than a man and more even than a sovereign. He became a memory that a whole country would carry in its heart, as faithfully as Douglas carried his heart into battle, down all the long years that followed, even unto this quiet night so far away. When we remember him still, consider, for a moment, the strange long reach of what Robert the Bruce set in motion through his daughter's brief and sorrowful life. For the blood that so nearly perished with him in the cages and on the scaffolds went on to flow through the veins of kings for the better part of 400 years. From the small grandson that Marjorie left behind there descended a long line of monarchs who ruled Scotland through generation after generation, through all the turns and troubles of the centuries that came after. And in the fullness of time, by the slow workings of marriage and inheritance and the failing of other lines, a sovereign of that same house came to wear, not only the crown of Scotland, but the crown of England too. So that the two realms which had torn at each other so terribly in Robert's day were joined at last under a single ruler in whose veins ran his blood. The hunted outlaw of the heather, who had lived with a price on his head and seen his own kin dragged off in chains, became in the end the forefather of the rulers of both the nations whose old war had shaped his life. There is a kind of poetry in that, slow and vast, working itself out far beyond his own sight. That one who had striven so hard simply to stay alive and to win his nation back should have founded a line that would sit upon the thrones of these islands for ages after he himself was dust. He could not have known it, lying weak and dying at Cardross. But the future he would never see was already folded, like a leaf within its bud, in the small grandchild he was leaving to the world. But let us turn away for a little while from the long marches of history and the fates of dynasties, and come back to the small and human world of his own day, to the kind of evening that Robert himself would have known 1,000 times, in the years before the wars and in the years of peace at the end. Picture a great hall in the heart of winter, in one of the castles or manors of the medieval north, as the early dark comes down outside and the cold presses against the walls. Within, the fire burns high on the central hearth or in the great chimney, throwing its red light and its leaping shadows up the stone walls and into the smoke-darkened rafters above. And the household gathers in its warmth as the light fails. There is the long table and the benches, and the lord in his high seat, and the household about him in their ranks, the knights and the squires and the servants, the whole little world of a great man's following gathered in for the evening meal. There is food, plain or rich, according to the season and the site, and ale and wine, and the talk and the laughter of people drawn close together against the gloom and the cold outside. And as the meal ends and the night settles in, there comes the best part of the long evening, the time of stories and of music, when a harper might take up his instrument and fill the smoky hall with the old airs, and a teller of tales might recite the deeds of heroes long dead, the very romances of Charlemagne and his knights that the young Robert had loved and learned by heart. In such evenings, hour upon hour through the winter nights, the common folk of that age found their comfort and their company, and it is in just such an evening that we ourselves are sitting now, in a way, listening to the old story unfold by the fire while the dark presses against the windows. For that is the oldest and the deepest purpose of a story like this one, far older than any book or any printed page. The telling of the deeds of those who came before, in the warm and the blackness, to ease the slow passage of the night. Long before anyone wrote the story of Robert the Bruce down, men and women were telling such stories aloud to one another by the fire, the tales of kings and heroes and great deeds done in the distant past. And the hearing of them was one of the chief pleasures and consolations of a hard life. There is something in us that has always loved to be told a tale as the day ends, to be carried out of our own small cares and into a larger and a braver world, to follow the fortunes of someone who lived and suffered and triumphed in ages past, and to feel, in the following, the curious peace that a good telling brings. The cares of our own day grow small and far away. The room around us softens and recedes. We are half here and half in another country and another age, walking the cold hills of medieval Scotland, watching a hunted king gather his courage in a cave, and the watching loosens something in us and lets us drift. That is what stories have always been for, in the last hours of the day, and it is what this one is for tonight. And there is no better use for the long deeds of the dead than to lay them gently, like this, between a weary listener and the dark, and let them carry you down towards sleep. There was an image that ordinary folk of the Middle Ages loved above almost all others, and that they painted on the walls of their churches and wove into their poems. And it fits the life of Robert the Bruce so closely that it might have been made for him. It was the image of the wheel of fortune, a great turning wheel upon which all the affairs of men were bound, with the goddess of fortune at its centre, blind and smiling, turning the wheel without pity or favour. On the rising side of the wheel, a man was carried upward toward power and glory. At the top he sat enthroned in triumph, and then, as the wheel turned on, he was carried down again, cast from the height into ruin and misery, while another took his place at the top, only to be cast down in his turn. It was the medieval way of understanding the terrible instability of fortune, the way the great are brought low and the low raised up, the way no triumph is ever secure and no man can trust the favour of the world to last. And was there ever a life that turned upon that wheel more completely than the life of Robert the Bruce? He was born near the top, a great lord's heir in a peaceful kingdom. He climbed higher still and seized a crown, and sat for a moment enthroned. And then the wheel turned and cast him down, all the way down, lower than any king had ever been cast into the cave and the cold sea and the hunted dark, his crown a mockery and his family in chains. By every lesson the wheel was supposed to teach, that should have been the end of him. Broken at the bottom, a warning to the proud. But Robert the Bruce did what the wheel was not supposed to allow. From the very bottom, he climbed back up and rose again to the summit, and this time he stayed there, and died a monarch in his bed, with his homeland free. He did not merely ride the wheel of fortune in the end. By sheer endurance and will, he came close to mastering it, and that mastery, that refusal to stay down when fortune had cast him to the lowest point, is the very heart of why men have never tired of telling his tale. And since his lowest point, the bottom of the wheel, was that bitter winter among the Western Isles, let us go there in our minds for a while, into the strange and beautiful sea world that sheltered him when all the rest of his kingdom had turned against him, for it was a world all its own, half land and half water, that few who have not seen it can quite imagine. Along the whole western edge of Scotland, the land breaks apart into a vast scattering of islands, large and small, divided by narrow sounds and broad sea locks, and open stretches of grey and restless water. A country where the sea runs in everywhere among the hills, and where a man travelled not by road, for there were almost none, but by boat. The people of that world were a seafaring people, the Gaelic islanders and the lords who ruled them, and their great vehicles were the long, lean, swift galleys, the Berlins, descended from the longships of the Norsemen who had once ruled those seas. Vessels driven by oar and by a single square sail, that could slip up a sea lock or dart between the islands or cross to island with equal ease. It was a proud and independent world, only loosely bound to the kings of Scots, ruled by its own great sea lords in their castles on the rocky shores, a realm of hard men and harder weather, of the cry of seabirds and the smell of salt and weed, of long crossings under grey skies and the green islands rising out of the water. And it was here, among these islands and these seafaring people, that Robert the Bruce found his refuge in the worst of his fortunes, sheltered by those of the western lords who befriended him, carried in their galleys among the isles, hidden in their wild country where his enemies could not easily follow. The sea that had always been Scotland's western wall became his hiding place and his road, and the hardy folk of that maritime world, so often at odds with the kings of the mainland, gave shelter to a broken king when the great lords of the lowlands would not. He owed his survival, in part, to that strange and watery country, and to the loyalty he found there, and it is worth remembering, when we think of him, that the warrior of Bannockburn was also, for a season, a fugitive in an open boat among the Western Isles, kept alive by the sea and the islanders and his own refusal to despair. There is a quiet lesson in that lowest stretch of his life, and it is one worth carrying with you towards sleep, for it is the gentlest and the truest thing his story has to teach. We do not, most of us, live lives of crowns and battles, and the troubles that press upon us in the long wakeful hours of the night are not the troubles of kings. But every life has its winters, its seasons when fortune's wheel has turned us downward, when all we hoped for seems lost, and the road ahead seems dark, when we lie awake and wonder how we will ever climb back toward the light. And the story of Robert the Bruce, stripped of all its spears and its kingship, is at the deepest level simply the story of a man who was cast all the way down to the bottom, who lost very nearly everything, and who did not give up, who gathered his patience in the cold and the dark and waited for the wheel to turn, and went on, and in the end came through. That is a thing worth knowing, in the small hours. When your own troubles feel heavy, the wheel turns, the winter passes, the lowest place is not always the last place. The hunted man in the cave became a sovereign at peace in his own country, and if he could climb back from where he had fallen, then perhaps the dark stretch of any life is not the end of its tale either, but only the turning of the wheel with better days unseen as yet, still waiting on the far side of the night. It is worth pausing, too, on what it actually meant to be a crowned ruler in that distant age. For kingship, then, was a very different thing from the offices and the powers we know now, and unless we feel something of its weight, we cannot quite understand why men fought and died so fiercely over a crown. A medieval king was not merely a ruler, a maker of laws, and a leader of armies. He was a sacred figure, set apart from other men, made holy by the rite of his crowning. At the heart of that rite was the anointing, when the monarch was touched with holy oil by the hands of the church, as the kings and priests of Scripture had been anointed, and by that anointing he was held to be changed, lifted above ordinary men into a special and sacred relation with God, the Lord's anointed, the embodiment in his own person of the whole realm and people he ruled. This is why the forms and the symbols mattered so much, why it mattered so terribly that the sacred stone had been carried off, and that the right hand should set the crown in place. Why Isabella Macduff risked everything to perform the ancient office of her house. A king made without the proper forms was a monarch with something lacking, and one made with them, even with a hasty circle of gold in place of the stolen crown, carried the whole weight of that sacred tradition upon his head. To the folk of that age, the sovereign was the living link between heaven and the kingdom, the figure in whose health and righteousness the welfare of the whole land was somehow bound up. And an anointed monarch was not a thing that could lightly be set aside. When Robert the Bruce was crowned at Scone, for all the poverty and danger of that day, he became in the eyes of his people something more than a man, the sacred head of the realm of Scotland. And it was as that, and not merely as a successful warlord, that men came to love and follow him, and that his memory was kept holy long after his death. And beneath the ruler, there was always the man, with a soul to be saved and a conscience to be answered. And we would do Robert an injustice if we thought of him only as a warrior and a ruler, and forgot the inner life that mattered in that age of faith more than any crown. For all his ruthlessness, Robert the Bruce was a genuinely religious man, as nearly all men then were, and the deepest shadow upon his life was not any defeat in the field, but the stain upon his soul from the deed at Dumfries. The blood shed before the altar, the sacrilege that had cut him off from the church, and that he feared, with the whole force of a believer's fear, had imperilled his eternal soul. That fear was no small thing, no mere political inconvenience. It was a wound in the centre of his being that he carried all his days, and much of what he did, beyond the winning of his wars, was an attempt to heal it. He was generous to the church, founding and endowing religious houses, giving lands and gifts to the abbeys and the monks, whose prayers he hoped would speed his spirit, supporting the bishops who had stood by him. He longed, as we have seen, to make the great penitential journey of the crusade, to wash away his sin in the holy war, and when he could not, he sent his very heart in his place. And at the end he sought, above all earthly things, to be reconciled to the church, to have the dread sentence of excommunication lifted, to die in peace with God and the faith of his fathers. There is something deeply human in this, in the spectacle of the hard and ruthless king, the man who had done terrible things to win his crown, haunted all his days by the fear of damnation and labouring to make his peace with heaven. He was not a saint, and never pretended to be, but he was a man who believed, who knew the weight of his own sins and feared the judgment to come, and who spent his life trying, in the ways his age understood, to set right what he had set wrong. And he died, in the end, reconciled and at peace, which was the thing he had wanted beneath all the crowns and the victories, more than anything else. Perhaps that is the most surprising fact of all about him, when the battles are done and the legend is set aside, that this conqueror, this founder of a dynasty, this national hero, whose name still rings down the centuries, was at the last a frightened and hopeful believer like any other, longing for forgiveness and for rest, the same man who could kill a rival before the altar and harry whole provinces without mercy, could also weep for the state of his soul and send his heart on pilgrimage to atone for his sins. He held both of these things within him, the ruthlessness and the faith, the violence and the longing for grace, and he was not unusual in that. For the men and women of that hard age commonly held such opposites together in a way that can puzzle us. Who, like our heroes, simpler? But it is exactly in that complication that the real man lives. Neither the spotless hero of the patriotic legend, nor the mere cynical schemer of his enemy's telling, but a flesh and blood human being of enormous courage and real cruelty and deep faith, who did great and terrible deeds and feared for his soul while he did them, and who came through to a hard-won peace at the end of a hard-fought life. That is the Robert the Bruce worth remembering, the whole man and not the marble statue, and it is a strange comfort, somehow, in the quiet of the night, to think of him so, across all the long centuries, as a real person who lived and feared and hoped and died, much as we all must, only with a kingdom resting on his shoulders. When the long account is drawn up and the final reckoning made, where does Robert the Bruce stand among the figures of history, and what, in the end, did his life amount to? The plainest answer is that he saved a nation that was very nearly lost, and that few men in any age can claim as much. When he began, Scotland had been conquered and unmade, its king stripped and shamed, its crown and its sacred symbols carried off. Its very existence as a kingdom struck out by the most powerful ruler of the age, who meant it to be merely the northern part of his own realm forever. Had there been no Robert the Bruce, or had he failed, it is entirely possible that Scotland, as a separate kingdom, would have ceased to be swallowed up as Wales was swallowed up, its identity slowly dissolved into that of its larger neighbour. That this did not happen, that Scotland survived as an independent kingdom for centuries more, with its own crown and its own laws and its own fierce sense of itself, is owed more to Robert the Bruce than to any other single man. He is in the truest sense a maker of his nation, one of those rare figures upon whom the whole future course of a people seems to turn, and his nation has honoured him accordingly, holding his name among the greatest it has ever produced, setting him beside the very few of whom it can be said that without them everything afterward would have been different. He belongs in that small company of leaders who took a cause that seemed hopeless, by sheer force of character and will and skill, carried it through to a victory that reshaped the map and the memory of their world. Kings are common enough in history, and conquerors, and even good rulers. Men who save a nation from extinction are rare, and Robert the Bruce was one of them. And yet, when all the weighing of his greatness is done, there is something that draws us back, in the quiet of a night like this, not to the grandeur of his achievement, but to the stillness that came after, to the long peace of the centuries settling over the spots where they laid him. Think of the Abbey of Dunfermline, where his body was buried among the kings of his line, and of how the years and then the centuries flowed over it, the seasons turning one into another, summer into autumn, into the long winters, the light moving across the old stones, day after day, season after season, age after age, while the monarch lay quiet beneath the floor, and the world he had fought so hard to shape went on and changed and forgot, and remembered him by turns. Think of the Abbey of Melrose in its green valley, where his heart was buried apart, and of the same long quiet settling there too. The same slow procession of the seasons over the spot where the restless heart of the Bruce came at last to rest after all its travels. Carried to a Spanish battlefield and home again to lie forever in the soft soil of the borders he had loved. The wars he fought are over. The men he killed and the men who died for him are 700 years in their graves. The kingdom he saved has seen more history than he could ever have dreamed. Joys and sorrows and changes beyond reckoning. And through it, all the sovereign has lain still in his two resting places, body and heart apart, while the centuries passed over him, like the shadows of clouds passing over a hillside. And the long peace that he won for his nation at such terrible cost became, in the end, his own. There is a deep and a gentle comfort in that thought, the thought of the rest that comes after the struggle, and it is a fitting one to dwell on as the night deepens. For all his life, Robert the Bruce was a man of action and of striving, hunted and fighting and labouring, never able for years on end to lay down the burden of his cause or to rest secure. And then at the last it was all over, the striving done, the victory won, and there was only the quiet, the long unbroken quiet of the grave in the old abbey, with the prayers of his people rising for him, and the seasons turning slowly overhead. Every life of struggle comes, in the end, to such a rest. Every burden is at last laid down. The hardest journey reaches its gentle ending, and the one who walked it is allowed, at the last, to stop and to be still and to sleep. There is no need to fear that stillness, and much, perhaps, to be consoled by, lying here in the warm dark at the end of your own day, with your own burdens set down for a little while and the stillness gathering around you. The good ruler rested at the last, after everything in peace, and the world went gently on without him, and that is how it is, and how it is meant to be, and there is a kind of sweetness in it, if you let yourself feel it, here in the soft hours, when the day is done and rest is near. Over the tomb at Dunfermline, when they laid the ruler in his tomb, there was set an inscription that named him, in the old words, the good Robert, the deliverer of his homeland. And there is something worth pondering in that single word, good, set upon the grave of a man who had done such hard and bloody things. For he was not virtuous in the way we might first mean the word, not gentle, not mild, not free of cruelty or sin. He had killed a man before an altar. He had harried whole provinces to ruin. He had been ruthless and calculating, and in his early years, faithless by turns. By the strict measure of the word, many a quieter and milder man has better claim to be called virtuous than Robert the Bruce. And yet his people called him worthy, and meant it, and the name has clung to him down all the centuries. And the reason tells us something true about how human beings remember and judge those who lead them. For when they named him the worthy king, they did not mean that he had been without fault. They meant that he had been the true king, the rightful one, the one who in the testing did not fail them, who took up a hopeless cause and carried it through, who suffered with his people and for them and gave them back, at the cost of his brothers and his peace, and very nearly his soul, the freedom they had thought was lost forever. Goodness in a king meant faithfulness to the trust of the crown, and Robert had been faithful to it past all expectation. And his people forgave him much, as men will forgive much in the one who saves them, and remembered him not by his sins, but by his deliverance. The good Robert, they wrote, and 100 generations of Scots have agreed, and there is a rough justice in it, for whatever else he was, he did not fail the common folk who depended on him. And in the end, that may be the truest goodness a ruler can have. And so the long story comes round, at last, toward its quiet ending, and we find ourselves, after all the battles and the betrayals and the carried heart, simply here, in the dark, at the close of a single ordinary night, 700 years and more after the good king died in his manor by the Clyde. It is worth remembering, before we let it all go, that the country he fought for is still there. The cold green hills of Scotland still rise under the changing sky. The grey seas still break upon the Western Isles, where he hid in the worst of his fortunes. The wind still comes down off the mountains with the smell of rain in it, as it did when he was a hunted man in the heather, and the long northern nights still come down over that land, as they came down over his camps and his castles and his lonely places of refuge. The same stars that wheeled over the field of Bannockburn on the night before the battle still wheel over Scotland now, and over wherever in the world you happen to be lying tonight, listening, the same darkness, the same hush, the same slow turning of the night toward the morning. There is a thread that runs through all of it, through all the centuries between his age and ours, the simple human thread of people lying down at the end of their days, in the dark, seeking rest, as he sought it, as you seek it now. The kings and the battles pass away. The kingdoms rise and fall and change their borders and their names. But the night comes down, gentle and the same, over every age and every land, and brings to the weary the one mercy that is offered equally to kings and to common folk alike, which is sleep, and the setting down for a while of every burden and the quiet that heals. So let the good king rest, where he has rested these 700 years, his body among the kings at Dunfermline, and his restless heart in the green quiet of Melrose. His wars long over, and his nation long free. And let the old story fold itself gently closed, like a book set down at the end of a long evening by the fire. There is nothing left now to fear or to strive for in it. The hunted man came home, the lost crown was won and held. The brothers and the loyal companions who died are 7 centuries at peace. And the suffering they bore has since passed into the stillness, where all suffering at last is gathered and laid to rest. It is a story in the end, for all its spears and its sorrows, that comes round to peace, the peace that comes after struggle, the repose that comes after the day, the quiet that comes, always and faithfully, after the night has run its course. And that is exactly the calm that is gathering around you now, in the warm and the dark, as the story winds down and the night deepens, and there is nothing left that you need to do or to think about or to carry, nothing at all, but to let go and breathe slow and drift. There is one more thing to say before the very end about all those bitter nights that the Bruce endured in the worst of his fortunes, and it is the gentlest of all and the truest. Through every one of them, the cold and the fearful nights in the cave, and the open boat and the winter wilderness, when his cause seemed dead and his enemies were hunting him, and he did not know whether he would see another year. There was one thing he could be certain of, the same truth that you can be certain of tonight, which is that the morning would come. However deep the night, however heavy the gloom, the dawn was always on its way, climbing slowly toward the eastern edge of the world, and in time the grey light would come stealing back over the hills, and the shadows would thin and lift, and the day would return. The people of that age knew the night far better than we do, for they had no easy light to push it back, only the small flame of a candle or the glow of a dying fire, and the winter nights were truly black and seemingly without end. But they knew too, with a certainty bred into them by a lifetime of watching, that the darkness never won, that however long it rained, the morning always broke it in the end. Faithful as the turning of the year, and there is a deep comfort in that old certainty, the oldest comfort there is, that the night does not last forever, that the longest and the hardest of nights gives way at last to the light. He lived through the longest nights a man can live through, and the morning came for him, as it always comes, and brought him in the end out of the dark and into the day. And the morning will come for you too, gently, after this night, as after every night, with no effort or worry of yours, while you rest. There is nothing you need do to bring it. It is already on its way. You have only to let the night carry you and trust the dawn to keep its ancient promise, as it kept it for the hunted king all those long years ago. And let us, in these last quiet moments, hold them all in our thoughts for a little while. Gently, ordinary folk who walk through this long story at the king's side, for they are all of them at peace now, every one, these 700 years and more. Elizabeth, the steadfast queen, who waited out her captivity and came home at last and stood beside him to the end. She is at rest. Marjorie, the daughter taken as a child and lost so young upon a Scottish road, she is at rest, and her blood went on to wear a crown she never saw. The sisters, Mary and Christian, who suffered so much for their brother's cause and outlived it to see him triumph, they are at peace. The brave Countess Isabella, who set the crown upon his head and paid for it with her freedom and her life, she is at peace now too, her ordeal 7 centuries behind her, her courage remembered still. The brothers, Neil and Thomas and Alexander and Edward, who gave their lives one after another for their brother's crown, they lie quiet now, their sacrifice not forgotten. And the faithful captains, the Black Douglas who carried the king's heart into his last battle and died for it, and Randolph who climbed the dark cliff for him, they are at rest, their loyalty shining down the centuries undimmed. All of them, the whole company of that long ago struggle, the loved and the lost, the loyal and the brave, all are gathered now into the same deep stillness. Their wars over, their sufferings ended, their long day done. And there is something tender and consoling in remembering them so, not in the moment of their suffering, but in the stillness that came after. All of them quiet now, all of them at peace. All the striving and the sorrow folded away at last into the great stillness that waits, in the end, for everyone, and that holds no terror in it, but only rest. For that is where every story comes, in the end, and every life, to the long sleep at the close of the day. And there is no sweeter place for a story to leave us than there on the threshold of sleep. With all the striving done, and all the loved ones at peace, and the night gathered soft and dark around us. We have come a long way together tonight, from a child born in a castle by the western sea, through battles and betrayals and a crown, won and lost and won again, through caves and cages, and the carrying of a heart to a far country, all the way to the quiet of the abbey and the quiet rest of the good king under the turning seasons. And now there is nowhere further to go, and nothing further to do, but to let it all settle, and grow still, and fade gently away, like the last light of the fire sinking down to embers, like the last words of an old tale trailing off into the dark, as the one who told them and the one who listened both let go, at the same slow breath, of the long day, and of the waking world, and of everything but the soft and gathering dark. If you were to trace upon a map the whole journey of his life, from the first day to the last, it would make a great wandering circle across the whole of Scotland and beyond. And there is a quiet pleasure, as the night deepens, in following it gently in the mind, place by place, as one might trace a familiar road toward home. It begins on that headland in the west, at Turnberry by the sea, where he was born to the sound of the gulls and the waves. It moves inland to the broad green valley of Annandale, his father's country in the south, and to the castles where he passed from boyhood into the hard knowledge of his dangerous inheritance. It travels to Scone, the sacred crowning place near the heart of the country, where the circle of gold was set upon his head on that desperate spring day. It scatters then, in the bad years, into the wild country, into the mountains and the glens and the high passes, where he was defeated and hunted, and out to the very edge of everything, to the cold islands of the west, and across the sea to Ireland, to the cave and the open boat, and the lowest depth of his fortunes. And then, as his fortunes turned, it gathers itself again and moves back into the heart of the kingdom, to the fields and castles he won back one by one, to Bannockburn by its little stream where everything was decided, to the towns and the abbeys and the halls of a king, at last secure. It comes to rest, at the end, in two spots, at Cardross by the Clyde, where he laid down his life in peace, and at Dunfermline among the kings, with his heart carried off on its strange last journey to Spain, and home again to Melrose. A whole life is written in those places, the whole arc of it, from the cradle by the western sea to the grave in the ancient abbey. And to follow it in the mind is to follow the shape of one man's passage through his age, the rising and the falling and the rising, the long road home. And here is a thought to rest in at the very last, before we let it all go, a thought about how much and how little a single life can be. Set against the vast sweep of history, against the centuries before him and the centuries after, the 700 years and more that have passed since he died. A single human span seems a very small thing, a brief candle lit and burning for its little while, and then put out. Soon gone, soon followed by others, soon all but forgotten. He lived for 54 years, a span not so very different from the span any of us is given. And then he died, as all men die, and the world went on. And yet small as that single span was against the long darkness of time, it made all the difference in the world to the people and the country that depended on it. Because that one man lived and endured and did not give up. A nation survived that might otherwise have perished, and millions of lives in the long centuries afterward were shaped by what he did in his brief span. It is one of the deepest mysteries of the human story. This, that a single ordinary life, no longer than our own, can matter so enormously, can turn the whole course of things, can send its effects rippling down the ages after the one who lived it has gone to dust. We none of us know what our own small lives will turn out to have meant, what difference our own brief candles will have made by the time they are spent. But the story of the good king is a quiet reminder that no life is too slight to matter, that endurance and faithfulness in one ordinary span of years can echo far beyond itself, and that the things we do in our own short while, unseen and unsung as they may seem, may yet ripple out further than we will ever live to know. So let that be the last thought, gentle and consoling, to carry with you down into sleep, that your own days, whatever their troubles, whatever burdens you lay down at last, when you lay down tonight, matters more than you can see, and reaches further than you know, just as the hunted kings did, all those long years ago. And now there is truly nothing more to tell, and nothing more to do, and nowhere further to go. The story is finished. The good king is at his rest, and all his company with him, and the deep night of his troubles ended in the morning, as your night will end in the morning, gently, while you sleep. The fire has sunk to embers. The tale is told, and there is only the warm dark now, and your own slow breathing, and the soft weight of sleep settling over you like a blanket drawn up against the cold. As the whole long story fades quietly away into the stillness and lets you go at last into your rest. If these long, slow journeys into the far-off past are a help to you on the nights when sleep is hard to find, then there will always be another one here waiting for you whenever you should want to wander back, and you would be most welcome to follow along, so that you need never go looking for the next one in the dark. But that is all for another time, and there is nothing now that you need to do about any of it. Naught at all to attend to or to remember. For now there is only the rest you have earned at the close of this day, and the quiet and the dark, and the slow and gentle drift down into sleep. We have walked a long way together this evening, through one of the great stories of the distant past, and now our walking is done, and it is time to let it all go, and to be still, and to sleep. Sleep well, stay warm, be kind to the people in your house, and I will see you in the next one. Good night.